Thought and elemental essence. Elemental essence when molded by thought adopts a certain color, a color which is expressive of the nature of the thought or feeling. Of course all that this really means is that the essence composing the thought form is for the time compelled to vibrate at a certain definite rate by the thought which is ensouling it. The evolution of the elemental essence is to learn to respond to all possible rates of undulation. When therefore a thought holds it for a time vibrating at a certain rate, it is helped to this extent, that it has now become habituated to that particular rate of oscillation, so that next time it comes within reach of a similar one, it will respond to it much more readily than before. Presently those atoms of essence, having passed back again into the general mass, will be caught up again by some other thought, and will then have to swing at some totally different rate. And so will evolve a little further by acquiring the capacity to respond to the second type of undulation. So by slow degrees the thoughts, not only of man, but also of nature spirits and devas, and even of animals so far as they do think, are evolving the elemental essence which surrounds them, slowly teaching here a few atoms, and there a few atoms, to respond to this or that different rate of oscillation, until at last a stage will be reached when all the particles of the essence shall be ready to answer at any moment to any possible rate of vibration. And that will be the completion of their evolution. It is for this reason that the occultist avoids when possible the destruction of an artificial elemental, even when it is of evil character, preferring rather to defend himself or others against it by using the protection of a shell. It is possible to dissipate an artificial elemental instantly by an exertion of will power, just as it is possible on the physical plane to kill a poisonous snake in order that it may do no further harm. But neither course of action would commend itself to an occultist, except in very unusual circumstances. Whether the thought ensouling it is evil or good makes no difference whatever to the essence. All that is required for its development is to be used by thought of some kind. The difference between the good and the evil would be shown by the quality of essence which it affected, the evil thought or desire needing for its appropriate expression the coarser or denser matter, while the higher thought would require correspondingly finer and more rapidly vibrating matter for its covering. There are plenty of undeveloped people always thinking the coarser lower thoughts, and their very ignorance and grossness are made use of by the great law as evolutionary forces to help on a certain stage of the work that is to be done. It is for us, who have learnt a little more than they, to strive ever to think the high and holy thoughts which cause the evolution of a finer kind of elemental matter, and so to work in a field where at present the laborers are far too few. Fourth section, Psychic Faculties. Psychic Powers. The possession of psychic powers does not necessarily involve high moral character, any more than does the possession of great physical strength. It is quite true that the man who enters the path of holiness will presently find such powers developing in him, but it is quite possible to gain many of the powers without the holiness. Powers can be developed by anyone who will take the trouble, and a man may learn clairvoyance or mesmerism just as he may learn to play the piano, if he is willing to go through the necessary hard work. It is far better and safer for the vast majority of people to work at the development of character, to try to fit themselves for the path, and to leave the powers to unfold in due course, as they certainly will. Some people are in too much of a hurry to do this, and set themselves to force the powers sooner. Well, if they are quite certain that they desire them only for the sake of helping others, and that they are wise enough to use them rightly, it may be that no harm will come of it. But it is not easy to be quite certain on these points, and the slightest deflection from the right line will mean disaster. If a man must try to obtain the powers, there are two ways open to him. Of course there are many more than two methods, but I mean that they all fall under two heads, the temporary and the permanent. The temporary method is to deaden the physical sense in some way, actively by drugs, by self-hypnotization, or by inducing giddiness, for example, or passively by being mesmerized, so that the astral senses may come to the surface. The permanent way is to work at the development of the ego, so that he may be able to control the lower vehicles and use them as he wishes. It is somewhat like controlling a troublesome horse. A man who knows nothing of riding may so stupefy a horse with drugs that he can somehow keep on his back, but that will not in the least enable him to control any other horse. So a man who stupefies his physical body may use his astral senses to some extent, but that will in no way help him to manage another physical body in his next birth. The man who will take the far greater trouble of learning to ride properly can then manage any horse, and the man who develops his ego until it can manage one set of vehicles will be able to control any others that are given to him in future lives. This latter course means real evolution, the other does not necessarily involve anything of the sort. It does not follow that everyone who is on the path must have psychic powers. They are not absolutely necessary until a certain stage of it is reached. Short of the real psychic powers, there are various other methods by which men endeavor to obtain some of the same results. One of these, for example, is the repetition of invocations. Charms and ceremonies may sometimes produce an effect, it depends upon the way in which they are performed. I have seen a man who was able to answer questions in rather a curious way. He first entranced himself by repeating charms over and over again, and his invocations not only influenced himself, but also attracted nature spirits who went for the desired information, obtained it and put it into his mind. Lord Tennyson, by repeating his own name over and over again and drawing his consciousness further and further within himself, raised himself into touch with the ego, and then all this life seemed to him child's play. And death nothing but the entrance into a greater life. The result of many repetitions may often be to throw oneself into the trance condition, but this is not a training of the ego. Its effects last at most only for one life, whereas the powers which result from real spiritual development reappear in subsequent bodies. The man who entrances himself by the repetition of words or charms may probably return as a medium or at least a mediumistic person in his next life, and it must be remembered that mediumship is not a power, but a condition. Such repetitions may easily lead on to the coarser physical mediumship, by which I mean the sitting for materialization and sensational phenomena of all sorts, which is frequently injurious to health. I do not know that mere trance-speaking injures the body quite so much, though considering the feebleness of the platitudes which are usually the staple of the communications it might certainly be thought likely to weaken the mind. Let us consider what it is that is required from a physical medium. When an entity on the astral plane, whether it be a dead man or a nature spirit, wants to produce any result on dense physical matter, to play on a piano for example, to cause raps, or to hold a pencil in order to write, he needs an etheric body through which to work, because astral matter cannot act directly on the lower forms of physical matter, but requires the etheric matter as an intermediary to convey the vibrations from the one to the other, much in the same way as a fire cannot be lighted with paper and coals alone. The wood is needed as an intermediary, otherwise the paper will all burn away without affecting the coal. That which constitutes a man a physical medium is a want of cohesion between the etheric and the dense parts of the physical vehicle. So that an astral entity can easily withdraw a good deal of the man's etheric body and use it for his own purposes. Of course he returns it, in fact its constant tendency is to flow back to the medium. As may be seen from the action of the materialized form, but still the frequent withdrawal of part of the man's body in this way cannot but cause great disturbance and danger to his health. The etheric double is the vehicle of vitality, the life principle, which is perpetually circulating through our bodies, and when any part of our etheric double is withdrawn that life circulation is checked and its current broken. A terrible drain on vitality is then set up, and that is why the medium is so often in a state of collapse after a séance, and also why so many mediums in the long run become drunkards. Having first taken to stimulants in order to satisfy the dreadful craving for support which is caused by this sudden loss of strength. It can never under any circumstances be a good thing for the health to be constantly subjected to such a drain as this, even though in some cases the more intelligent and careful spirits try to pour strength into their medium after a séance, in order to make up for the loss, and thus support him without absolute breakdown for a much longer period than would otherwise be possible. In cases of materialization, dense physical matter, probably chiefly in the form of gases or liquids, is frequently borrowed from the body of the medium, who actually decreases temporarily in size and weight. And when it takes place, naturally that is a further source of serious disturbance to all the functions. Of the mediums with whom I used to have sittings 30 years ago, one is now blind, another died a confirmed drunkard, and a third, finding himself menaced apoplexy and paralysis, escaped with his life only by giving up seances altogether. Another form of materialization is that in which the astral body is temporarily solidified. The ordinary materializing spirit takes his material from the medium, because that, being already specialized, is more easily arranged into human form, and more readily condensed and molded than free ether would be. No one connected with any school of white magic would think it right to interfere with the etheric double of any man in order to produce a materialization, nor would he disturb his own if he wished to make himself visible at a distance. He would simply condense, and build into and around his astral body a sufficient quantity of the surrounding ether to materialize it, and hold it in that form by an effort of will as long as he needed it. When part of the etheric double is removed from the physical, as in the case of materialization of the ordinary kind, a connecting current is visible to anyone capable of seeing matter in the etheric condition. But the method of connection with the astral body is entirely different, for nothing in the nature of a cord or current of astral matter joins the two forms. Yet it is difficult to express in terms of this plane the exact nature of the exceeding closeness of the sympathy between them. Perhaps the nearest approximation we can get to the idea is that of two instruments tuned to exactly the same pitch, so that whatever note is struck upon one of them instantly evokes a precisely corresponding sound from the other. There is no harm in using willpower to cure diseases, so long as no money or other consideration is taken for what is done. There are several methods, the simplest is the pouring in of vitality. Nature will cure most diseases if the man can be strengthened and supported while she is left to do her work. This is especially true of the various nervous diseases which are so painfully common at the present day. The rest cure, which is often advised for them, is quite the best thing that can be suggested, but recovery might often be greatly hastened if vitality were poured into the patient in addition. Any man who has surplus vitality may direct it by his will to a particular person. When he is not doing that, it simply radiates from him in all directions, flowing out principally through the hands. If a man is depleted of strength so that his spleen does not do its work properly, the pouring in of specialized vitality is often of the greatest help to him in keeping the machinery of the body going until he is able to manufacture it for himself. Many minor diseases can be cured merely by increasing the circulation of the vitality. A headache, for example, is generally due either to a slight congestion of blood, or to a similar congestion of the vital fluid. In either case, a clairvoyant who can see the obstruction may deal with it by sending a strong current through the head, and washing away the congested matter. A man who cannot see can also produce this result, but since he does not know exactly where to direct this force, he generally wastes a great deal of it. Sometimes people perform cures by imposing their own magnetic conditions upon others. This is based on the theory, which is quite correct, that all disease is in harmony of some sort, and that if perfect harmony can be restored the disease will disappear. So in this case the person who wishes to effect a cure first raises his own vibrations to the highest degree which is possible for him, fills himself with thoughts of love and health and harmony, and then proceeds to enfold the patient within his aura, the idea being that his own powerful vibrations will overbear these of the patient, and gradually bring him into the same harmonious and healthy condition. This method is often effective, but we must remember that it involves imposing the whole of the personality of the magnetiseur upon the patient, which may not always be desirable for either of the persons concerned. One should take care not to be caught or entangled on the astral plane, as a man easily may be, and that through his virtues as well as his vices, if he be not exceedingly cautious. For example, it is possible to affect others by thought, and thus obtain whatever is wanted from them, and the temptation of this power to an ordinary man would be overwhelming. Again, you could easily force those whom you love out of a wrong path into a right one if you wished, but this you must not do, you may only persuade and argue. Here again is a temptation. You may by force prevent your friend from doing wrong, but often the weakening effect of the compulsion on his mind will do him more harm than the wrongdoing from which you save him. Drunkenness can be cured by mesmerizing the man, but it is far better to persuade him gradually to conquer the weakness for himself, since this is a thing which he will have to do in some life. It is said that in some cases the man has yielded himself to this awful habit for so long that his will power is entirely in abeyance, and he actually has not the strength to refrain. And it is claimed that for such a man mesmerism is necessary, for it is the only method of giving him an opportunity to reassert himself as a human being, and to regain some sort of control of his vehicles. This may be so, and I can well understand the desire to save by any lawful means the soul which has come to so dire a pass, yet even then I would counsel the greatest care in the use of mesmerism, and in the choice of the mesmerist. A man can use the faculties of his astral body without moving away from his physical vehicle. That is called the possession of astral powers in the waking state, and is a definite stage in development. But it is more usual for the astral body to leave the physical when it is intended to operate or observe at a distance from the physical body. The Indian term, skywalker, generally refers only to one who is able thus to travel in his astral body. But sometimes also it means levitation, in which the physical body is lifted and floats in the air. In India this happens to some ascetics, and some of the greatest of Christian saints have in deep meditation been thus raised from the ground. It involves, however, the expenditure of a good deal of force. When a disciple is commissioned to undertake some special work for humanity, the adepts may give to him for the purpose some extra force, but though he is left free to use it as he pleases, he must not fritter it away uselessly. So it happens that even those who can produce these strange effects will do not do so to amuse themselves or others, but only for real work. It would be quite possible for some disciple to use this force for the purpose of carrying his physical body through the air to a distant place. But as that would mean a tremendous expenditure of force, it is not likely that he would so use it unless definitely directed to do so. On the other hand, there have been cases in which such powers were used, for example, to save a man from undeserved suffering. There was once a case in which a young man was accused of the forgery of an important document. He was to a certain extent technically guilty, although quite innocent of any evil intention. He had very foolishly imitated a certain signature upon a blank sheet of paper, and then someone who was unfriendly to him had obtained possession of the sheet of paper, written in certain instructions above the signature, and then cleverly cut the paper so as to make it appear to be a letter conveying orders. The accused had to admit that the signature was in his writing, but his account of the circumstances under which it was written was not unnaturally disbelieved, and it seemed impossible for him to escape the most terrible consequences. But it happened that one of our masters was called as a witness to testify to the handwriting of the prisoner. The sheet was handed to him with the question, "Do you recognize that handwriting as that of the prisoner?" The master just glanced at it, and instantly returned it, saying, "Is this the sheet which you intended to give me?" In that instant the sheet had become an absolute blank. The counsel for the prosecution of course supposed that in some utterly incomprehensible way he had mislaid the paper, but for want of it the prosecution fell through, and so the young man was saved. Clairvoyance. The possession of clairvoyant power is a very great privilege and a very great advantage, and if properly and sensibly used it may be a blessing and a help to its fortunate holder, just as surely as, if it is misused, it may often be a hindrance and a curse. The principal dangers attendant upon it arise from pride, ignorance, and impurity, and if these be avoided, as they easily may be, nothing but good can come from it. Pride is the first great danger. The possession of a faculty which, though it is the heritage of the whole human race, is as yet manifested only very occasionally, often causes the ignorant clairvoyant to feel himself, or still more frequently herself, exalted above his fellows. Chosen by the Almighty for some mission of worldwide importance, dowered with a discernment that can never err, selected under angelic guidance to be the founder of a new dispensation, and so on. It should be remembered that there are always plenty of sportive and mischievous entities on the other side of the veil who are ready and even anxious to foster all such delusions, to reflect and embody all such thoughts, and to fill whatever role of archangel or spirit guide may happen to be suggested to them. Unfortunately, it is so fatally easy to persuade the average man that he really is a very fine fellow at bottom, and quite worthy to be the recipient of a special revelation. even though his friends have through blindness or prejudice somehow failed hitherto to appreciate him. Another danger, perhaps the greatest of all because it is the mother of all others, is ignorance. If the clairvoyant knows anything of the history of his subject, if he at all understands the conditions of those other planes into which his vision is penetrating, he cannot of course suppose himself the only person who was ever so highly favored. Nor can he feel with self-complacent certainty that it is impossible for him to mistake. But when he is, as so many are, in the densest ignorance as to history, conditions, and everything else, he is liable in the first place to make all kinds of mistakes as to what he sees. And secondly to be the easy prey of all sorts of designing and deceptive entities from the astral plane. He has no criterion by which to judge what he sees, or thinks he sees, no test to apply to his visions or communications, and so he has no sense of relative proportion or the fitness of things. And he magnifies a copybook maxim into a fragment of divine wisdom, a platitude of the most ordinary type into an angelic message. Then again, for want of common knowledge on scientific subjects he will often utterly misunderstand what his faculties enable him to perceive, and he will in consequence gravely promulgate the grossest absurdities. The third danger is that of impurity. The man, who is pure in thought and life, pure in intention and free from the taint of selfishness, is by that very fact guarded from the influence of undesirable entities from other planes. There is in him nothing upon which they can play, he is no fit medium for them. On the other hand, all good influences naturally surround such a man, and hasten to use him as a channel through which they may act, and thus a still further barrier is erected about him against all which is mean and low and evil. The man of impure life or motive, on the contrary, inevitably attracts to himself all that is worst in the invisible world which so closely surrounds us. He responds readily to it, while it will be hardly possible for the forces of good to make any impression upon him. But a clairvoyant who will bear in mind all these dangers, and strive to avoid them, who will take the trouble to study the history and the rationale of clairvoyance, who will see to it that his heart is humble and his motives are pure, such a man may assuredly learn very much from these powers of which he finds himself in possession, and may make them of the greatest use to him in the work which he has to do. Having first taken good heed to the training of his character, let him observe and note down carefully any visions which come to him. Let him patiently endeavor to disentangle the core of truth in them from the various accretions and exaggerations which are sure at first to be almost inextricably confused with them. Let him in every possible way test and check them and endeavor to ascertain which of them are reliable, and in what way these reliable ones differ from others which have proved less trustworthy, and he will very soon find himself evolving order out of chaos, and learning to distinguish what he can trust and what he must for the present put aside as incomprehensible. He will probably find in course of time that he gets impressions, whether by direct sight or only by feeling, in reference to the various people with whom he comes into contact. Once more the careful noting down of every such impression as soon as it occurs, and the impartial testing and checking of it as opportunity offers, will soon show our friend how far these feelings or visions are to be relied on. And as soon as he finds that they are correct and dependable he has made a very great advance. For he is in possession of a power which enables him to be of far more use to those among whom his work lies than he could be if he knew only as much about them as can be seen by the ordinary eye. If, for example, his sight includes the auras of those around him, he can judge from what it shows him how best to deal with them, how to bring out their latent good qualities, how to strengthen their weaknesses, how to repress what is undesirable in their characters. Again, his power may often enable him to observe something of the processes of nature, to see something of the working of the non-human evolutions which surround us, and thus to acquire most valuable knowledge on all kinds of recondite subjects. If he happens to be personally acquainted with some clairvoyant who has been put under regular training he has of course a great advantage, in that he can without difficulty get his visions examined and tested by one upon whom he can rely. Generally speaking, then, the course to be recommended to the untrained clairvoyant is that of exceeding patience and much watchfulness. But with this hope ever before his eyes, that assuredly if he makes use of the talent entrusted to him it cannot but attract the favorable notice of those who are ever watching for instruments which can be employed in the great work of evolution. And that when the right time comes he will receive the training which he so earnestly desires, and will thus be enabled definitely to become one of those who help the world. Special training should be arranged from early childhood for clairvoyant children. The modern system of education tends to suppress all psychic faculties, and most young people are overstrained by their studies. In Greece and Rome these psychic children were promptly isolated as Vestal virgins or postulants for the priesthood, and specially trained. There is a natural tendency in the present day, apart from education, to repress these faculties. The best way to prevent the loss of these to the world is to put the boys into some sort of monastery where the monks know about the higher life and try to live it, for family life is not suitable for this development. Where such clairvoyance appears it ought to be encouraged, for many additional investigators are wanted for the society's work, and those who begin young are likely to adapt themselves to it most readily. People who are psychic by birth generally use the etheric double a great deal. People who possess what has sometimes been called etheric sight, that is, sight capable of observing physical matter in a state of exceedingly fine subdivision. Though not yet capable of discerning the subtler matter of the astral plane, frequently see, when they look keenly at any exposed portion of the human body, such as the face or the hand, multitudes of tiny forms, such as dice, stars, and double pyramids. These belong neither to the thought plane nor to the astral, but are purely physical, though of exceeding minuteness. They are simply the physical emanation from the body, which is always taking place, the waste matter, consisting largely of finely divided salts, which is constantly being thrown out in this manner. The character of these tiny particles varies from many causes. Naturally loss of health often alters them entirely, but any wave of emotion will affect them to a greater or lesser extent, and they even respond to the influence of any definite train of thought. Professor Gates is reported as saying, a. that the material emanations of the living body differ according to the states of the mind as well as the conditions of the physical health. b. that these emanations can be tested by the chemical reactions of some salts of selenium. c. that these reactions are characterized by various tints or colors according to the nature of the mental impressions. d. that 40 different emotion products, as he calls them, have already been obtained. People sometimes see animated particles quivering with intense rapidity, and dashing about in the air before them. This again shows the possession of much increased physical power, not of mental. It is unfortunately only too common for the person who gains for the first time a glimpse of astral or even of etheric matter to jump at once to the conclusion that he is at least upon the mental level, if not upon the nirvanic, and holds in his hand the key to all the mysteries of the entire solar system. All that will come in good time, and these grander vistas will assuredly open before him one day. But he will hasten the coming of that desirable consummation if he makes sure of each step as he takes it, and tries fully to understand and make the best of what he has, before desiring more. Those who begin their experience with nirvanic vision are few and far between. For most of us, progress must be slow and steady, and the safest motto for us is festina lente. I should not advise anyone to allow himself to be thrown into mesmeric sleep for the purpose of gaining clairvoyant experiences. The domination of the will by that of another produces effects that few people realize. The will of the victim becomes weaker, and is more liable to be acted upon by others. In the scheme of things no man is forced to do anything, he is taught by receiving always the result of his actions. And it is better to allow clairvoyant powers to come gradually in the natural course of evolution, rather than to try to force them in any way. We must not always assume that a man who sees something pertaining to higher planes is necessarily becoming clairvoyant. By clairvoyance, for example, we may undoubtedly see an apparition, but on the other hand there are various other ways in which a man may see or suppose himself to see something which to him would be exactly the same as an apparition. The apparition of a dead person may be, a. one's own imagination, b. a thought form produced by another person, c. or by the person seen, d. an impersonation, e. the etheric double of the person, or f. the real person actually there. In the last case one of three things must have happened, that is, supposing that the apparition is a dead or sleeping person in his astral body, and that the man who sees him is himself in his physical body in wide awake. Either, a, the dead man has materialized himself, in which case of course he is for the time a physical object, which may be seen by any number of people with ordinary physical sight. B, the dead man is in his astral body, in which case only those possessing astral sight can perceive him. He has probably succeeded by some special effort in temporarily opening that sight for the person to whom he wishes to show himself, and is therefore most likely visible to that one person only, and not to any others who may happen to be present. Or, C, the dead man has mesmerized the living, so as to impose upon him the idea that he sees a figure which is not really visible to him, though it may be really present. If the apparition be an etheric double, it will not stray far away from the dense body to which it belongs or used to belong. An unpracticed apparition, one who is new to the astral plane, often shows traces of the habits of his earth life. He will enter and depart by a door or a window, not yet realizing that he can pass through the wall just as easily. I have even seen one squeeze through the crack of a locked door. He might as well have tried the keyhole. But he moves as he has been accustomed to move, as he thinks of himself as moving. For the same reason an apparition often walks upon the earth, when he might just as well float through the air. It is a mistake to think that if you see a vision, it must necessarily mean something for you, or be specially sent to you. If you for the moment become sensitive, you see what happens to be there. Suppose I am sitting in a room, and a curtain is drawn across the window, so that the street outside is invisible to me. Suppose the wind lifts the curtain for a moment, so that I get a glimpse of the street, I shall then see whatever happens to be passing at that moment. Let us imagine that I see a little girl in a red cloak, carrying a basket. That little girl is probably going about her own business, or perhaps her mother's. Should I not be very foolish if I chose to fancy that she had been sent there especially for me to see, and began to worry myself as to what could be symbolized by the red cloak and the basket? A flash of clairvoyance is usually just the accidental lifting of a curtain, and generally what is seen has no special relation to the seer. There may occasionally be instances in which the curtain is intentionally lifted by a friend because something of personal interest is passing, but we must not be too ready to assume that that is the case. Among the real psychic powers, however, which are attained by slow and careful self-development, there are some which are of very great interest. For example, for one who can function freely in the mental body there are methods of getting at the meaning of a book, quite apart from the ordinary process of reading it. The simplest is to read from the mind of one who has studied it. But this is open to the objection that one gets not the real meaning of the work but that student's conception of the meaning, which may be by no means the same thing. A second plan is to examine the aura of the book, a phrase which needs a little explanation for those not practically acquainted with the hidden side of things. An ancient manuscript stands in this respect in a somewhat different position from a modern book. If it is not the original work of the author himself, it has at any rate been copied word by some person of a certain education and understanding, who knew the subject of the book, and had his own opinions about it. It must be remembered that copying, done usually with a stylus, is almost as slow and emphatic as engraving, so that the writer inevitably impresses his thought strongly on his handiwork. Any manuscript, therefore, even a new one, has always some sort of thought aura about it which conveys its general meaning, or rather one man's idea of its meaning in his estimate of its value. Every time it is read by anyone an addition is made to that thought aura, and if it be carefully studied the addition is naturally large and valuable. This is equally true of a printed volume. A book which has passed through many hands has an aura which is usually better balanced than that of a new one, because it is rounded off and completed by the divergent views brought to it by its many readers. Consequently, the psychometrization of such a book generally yields a fairly full comprehension of its contents, though with a considerable fringe of opinions not expressed in the book, but held by its various readers. On the other hand, a book used in a public library is not infrequently as unpleasant psychically as it usually is physically, for it becomes loaded with all kinds of mixed magnetisms, many of them of a most unsavory character. The sensitive person will do well to avoid such books, or if necessity compels him to use them he will be wise to touch them as little as may be, and rather to let them lie upon a table than to hold them in his hand. Another factor to be remembered with regard to such book is that a volume written upon a special subject is most likely to be read by a particular type of person, and these readers leave their impress upon the aura of the volume. Thus a book violently advocating some sectarian religious views is not read except by persons who sympathize with its narrowness, and so it soon develops a decidedly unpleasant aura. And in the same way a book of an indecent or prurient nature quickly becomes loathsome beyond description. Old books containing magical formulae are often for this reason most uncomfortable neighbors. Even the language in which a book is printed indirectly affects its aura, by limiting its readers largely to men of a certain nationality, and so by degrees endowing it with the more prominent characteristics of that nationality. In the case of a printed book there is no original copyist, so that at the beginning of its career it usually carries nothing but disjointed fragments of the thought of the binder and bookseller. Few readers at the present day seem to study so thoughtfully and thoroughly as did the men of old. And for that reason the thought forms connected with a modern book are rarely so precise and clear-cut as those which surround the manuscripts of the past. The third method of reading requires some higher powers, in order to go behind the book or manuscript altogether and get at the mind of its author. If the book is in some foreign language, its subject entirely unknown, and there is no aura around it to give any helpful suggestion, the only way is to follow back its history to see from what it was copied, or set up in type. As the case may be, and so to trace out the line of its descent until one reaches its author. If the subject of the work be known, a less tedious method is to psychometrize that subject, get into the general current of thought about it, and so find the particular writer required, and see what he thinks. There is a sense in which all the ideas connected with a given subject may be said to be local, to be concentrated round a certain point in space, so that by mentally visiting that point one can come into touch with all the converging streams of thought about that subject. Though these are linked by millions of lines with all sorts of other subjects. Another interesting power is that of magnification. There are two methods of magnification which may be used in connection with the clairvoyant faculty. One is simply an intensification of ordinary sight. It is obvious that when in common life we see anything, an impact of some sort is made upon the retina, upon its physical rods and cones. The effects there produced, or the vibrations set up, are transmitted, in some way by no means thoroughly understood, by the optic nerve to the gray matter of the brain. Clearly before the true man within can become conscious of what is seen, these impressions made upon the physical brain matter must be transmitted from that to the etheric matter, from that in turn to the astral, and from that to the mental, these different degrees of matter being, as it were, stations on a telegraph wire. One method of magnification is to tap this telegraph wire at an intermediate station, to receive the impression upon the etheric matter of the retina instead of upon the physical rods and cones. And to transfer the impression received directly to the etheric part of the brain by an effort of will. The attention can be focused in only a few of the etheric particles, or even in one of them. And in that way a similarity of size can be attained between the organ employed and some minute object which is to be observed. A method more commonly used, but requiring somewhat higher development, is to employ the special faculty of the center between the eyebrows. From the central portion of that can be projected what we may call a tiny microscope, having for its lens only one atom. In this way again we produce an organ commensurate in size with the minute objects to be observed. The atom employed may be either physical, astral or mental, but whichever it is it needs a special preparation. All its spirally must be opened up and brought into full working order, so that it is just as it will be in the seventh round of our chain. This power belongs to the causal body, so if an atom of lower level be used as an eyepiece a system of reflecting counterparts must be introduced. The atom can be adjusted to any subplane, so that any required degree of magnification can be applied in order to suit the object which is being examined. A further extension of the same power enables the operator to focus his own consciousness in that lens through which he looks, and then to project it to distant points. The same power, by a different arrangement, can be used for diminishing purposes when one wishes to view as a whole something far too large to be taken in at once by ordinary vision. The mystic chord. Questions have often been asked as to the method by which a person at a distance of some thousands of miles can be instantly found by a trained clairvoyant. Apparently this remains somewhat of a mystery to many, so I will endeavor to give an explanation of the plan commonly adopted, though it is not easy to put it quite plainly. A clear expression of superphysical facts cannot be achieved in physical words, for the latter are always to some extent misleading even when they seem most illuminative. Man's various forces and qualities, manifesting in his bodies as vibrations, send out for each vehicle what may be called a keynote. Take his astral body as an example. From the number of different vibrations which are habitual to that astral body there emerges a sort of average tone, which we may call the keynote of the man on the astral plane. It is obviously conceivable that there may be a considerable number of ordinary men whose astral keynote is practically the same, so that this alone would not suffice to distinguish them with certainty. But there is a similar average tone for each man's mental body, for his causal body, and even for the etheric part of his physical body. And there have never yet been found two persons whose keynotes were identical at all these levels, so as to make exactly the same chord when struck simultaneously. Thus the chord of each man is unique, and it furnishes a means by which he can always be distinguished from the rest of the world. Among millions of primitive savages there may possibly be cases where development is as yet so slight that the chords are scarcely clear enough for the differences between them to be observed. But with any of the higher races there is never the least difficulty, nor is there any risk of confusion. Whether the man be sleeping or waking, living or dead, his chord remains the same, and he can always be found by it. How can this be so, it may be asked, when he is resting in the heaven world, and has therefore no astral or etheric body to emit the characteristic sounds? So long as the causal body itself remains, it has always attached to it its permanent atoms, one belonging to each of the planes, and therefore, wherever he goes, the man in his causal body carries his chord with him. For the single atom is quite sufficient to give out the distinctive sound. The trained seer, who is able to sense the chord, attunes his own vehicles for the moment exactly to its notes, and then by an effort of will sends forth its sound. Wherever in the three worlds that man who is sought may be, this evokes an instantaneous response from him. If he be living in the physical body, it is quite possible that in that lower vehicle he may be conscious only of a slight shock, and may not in the least know what has caused it. But his causal body lights up instantly. It leaps up like a great flame, and this response is at once visible to the seer, so that by that one action the man is found, and a magnetic line of communication is established. The seer can use that line as a kind of telescope, or if he prefers he can send his consciousness flashing along it with the speed of light and see from the other end of it, as it were. The combination of sounds which will produce a man's chord is his true occult name, and it is in this sense that it has been said that when a man's true name is called he instantly replies, wherever he may be. Some vague tradition of this is probably at the back of the idea so widely spread among savage nations, that a man's real name is a part of him, and must be carefully concealed, because one who knows it has a certain power over him, and can work magic upon him. Thus also it is said that the man's true name is changed at each initiation, since each such ceremony is at once the official recognition in the fulfillment of a progress by which he has, as it were, raised himself into a higher key, putting an additional strain upon the strings of his instrument, and evoking from it far grander music, so that thenceforward his chord must be sounded differently. This name of the man must not be confused with the hidden name of the ogoids, for that is the chord of the three principles of the ego, produced by the vibrations of the atmic, buddhic and mental atoms, and the monad behind them. In order to avoid such confusion we must keep clearly in mind the distinction between two manifestations of the man at different levels. The correspondence between these two manifestations is so close that we may almost consider the lower as the repetition of the higher. The ego is triple, consisting of Atma, Buddhi, Manas, three constituents each existing on its own plane, the Atma on the nirvanic, the Buddhi on the buddhic, and the Manas on the highest level of the mental. This ego inhabits a causal body, a vehicle built of the matter of the lowest of the three planes to which he belongs. He then puts himself further down into manifestation, and takes three lower vehicles, the mental, astral and physical bodies. His chord in this lower manifestation is that which we have been describing, and consists of his own note and those of the three lower vehicles. Just as the ego is triple, so is the monad, and this also has its three constituents, each existing on its own plane. But in this case the three planes are the first, second and third of our system, and the nirvanic is the lowest of them instead of the highest. But on that nirvanic level it takes to itself a manifestation, and we call it the monad in its atmic vehicle, or sometimes the triple atma or triple spirit, and this is for it what the causal body is for the ego. Just as the ego takes on three lower bodies, mental, astral, physical, the first of which, the mental, is on the lower part of his own plane, and the lowest, the physical, 2 planes below. So the monad takes on three lower manifestations, which we commonly call atma, buddhi, manas, the first of which is on the lower part of his plane, and the lowest 2 planes below that. It will thus be seen that the causal body is to the monad what the physical body is to the ego. If we think of the ego as the soul of the physical body, we may consider the monad as the soul of the ego in turn. Thus the chord of the ogoids, the glorified ego in his causal body, consists of the note of the monad, with those of its three manifestations, atma, buddhi, manas. It must be understood that the chord cannot be accurately considered as sound in the sense in which we use that word on this plane. It has been suggested to me that an analogy which is in some respects better is that of the combination of lines in a spectrum. Each of the elements whose spectrum is known to us is instantly recognizable by it, in whatever star it may appear, no matter how great the distance may be, so long as the lines are bright enough to be seen at all. But the chord of which we have been speaking is not actually either heard or seen, it is received by a complex perception which requires the practically simultaneous activity of the consciousness in the causal body and in all the lower vehicles. Even with regard to ordinary astral perception it is misleading, though practically unavoidable, to speak of hearing and seeing. These terms connote for us the idea of certain sense organs which receive impressions of a well-defined type. To see implies the possession of an eye, to hear implies the existence of an ear. But no such sense organs are to be found on the astral plane. It is true that the astral body is an exact counterpart of the physical, and that it consequently shows eyes and ears, nose and mouth, hands and feet, just as the latter does. But when functioning in the astral body we do not walk upon the astral counterparts of our physical feet, nor do we see and hear with the counterparts of our physical eyes and ears. Each particle in an astral body is capable of receiving a certain set of vibrations, those belonging to its own level, and those only. If we divide all astral vibrations into 7 sets, just like 7 octaves in music, each octave will correspond to a subplane. And only a particle in the astral body which is built of matter belonging to that subplane can respond to the vibrations of that octave. So, to be upon a certain subplane in the astral, is to have developed the sensitiveness of only those particles in one's astral body which belong to that subplane, so that one can perceive the matter and the inhabitants of that subplane only. To have perfect vision upon the astral plane means to have developed sensitiveness in all particles of the astral body, so that all the subplanes are simultaneously visible. Even though a man has developed the particles of one subplane only, if those are fully developed he will have on that subplane a power of perception equivalent to all of our physical senses. If he perceives an object at all, he will in that one act of perception receive from it an impression which conveys all that we learn down here through those various channels which we call the senses, he will simultaneously see, hear and feel it. The instantaneous perception which belongs to higher planes is still further removed from the clumsy and partial action of the physical senses. In order to see how the chord helps the clairvoyant to find any given person, it must also be understood that the vibrations which cause it are communicated by the man to any object which is for some time in close contact with him, and therefore permeated by his magnetism. A lock of his hair, an article of clothing which he has worn, a letter which he has written, any of these is sufficient to give the chord to one who knows how to perceive it. It can also be obtained very readily from a photograph, which seems more curious, since the photograph need not have been in direct contact with the person whom it represents. Even untrained clairvoyants, who have no scientific knowledge of the subject, instinctively recognize the necessity of bringing themselves en rapport with those whom they seek by means of some such objects. It is not necessary for the seer to hold the letter in his hand while examining the case, or even to have it near him. Having once held the letter and sensed the chord, he is able to remember it and reproduce it, just as anyone with a good memory might remember a face after seeing it once. Some such link as this is always necessary to find a person previously unknown. We had recently a case of a man who had died somewhere in the Congo district, but as no photograph of him was sent by the friend who wrote about him, it was necessary first to seek that friend, somewhere in Scandinavia, I think, and make a contact in a roundabout way through him. There are, however, other methods of finding people at a distance. One which is most effective requires higher development than that just described. A man who is able to raise his consciousness to the atomic level of the Buddhic plane there finds himself absolutely in union with all his fellow men, and therefore of course among the rest with the person whom he seeks. He draws his consciousness up into this unity along his own line, and he has only to put himself out again along the line of that other person in order to find him. There are always various ways of exercising clairvoyance, and each student employs that which comes most naturally to him. If he has not fully studied his subject, he often thinks his own method the only one possible, but wider knowledge soon disabuses him of that idea. How past lives are seen. As a series of past lives of enthralling interest has recently been published in the Theosophist, many inquiries have been received as to the exact method by which the record of such lives is read by the investigators. It is not easy to explain the matter satisfactorily to those who have not themselves the power to see them, but some attempt at a description of the process may at least help students on the way towards comprehension. To begin with, it is by no means easy to explain what the record is which is to be read. A suggestion leading towards an idea of it may perhaps be obtained by imagining a room with a huge pier glass at one end. Everything which took place in that room would be reflected in that mirror. If we further suppose that mirror to be endowed with the properties of a kind of perpetual cinematograph, so that it records all which it reflects, and can afterwards under certain circumstances be made to reproduce it, we have advanced one stage towards understanding how the record presents itself. But we must add to our conception qualities which no mirror ever possessed, the power to reproduce all sounds as a phonograph does, and also to reflect and reproduce thoughts and feelings. Then we must further try to understand what the reflection in a mirror really is. If two persons stand in relation to a mirror so that each sees in it not himself but the other, it is obvious that the same area of glass is reflecting the two images. Therefore if we suppose the glass to retain permanently every image which has ever been cast upon it, perhaps it actually does, it is again clear that the same part of the glass must be simultaneously recording those two images. Move up and down and from side to side, and you will soon convince yourself that every particle of glass must be simultaneously recording every part of every object in the room. And that what you happen to see in it depends upon the position of your eye. Hence it also follows that no two people can ever see at the same moment exactly the same reflection in a mirror, any more than two people can see the same rainbow. Because two physical eyes cannot simultaneously occupy exactly the same point in space. What we have supposed to happen with regard to the particles of our mirror does really happen with regard to every particle of every substance. Every stone by the roadside contains an indelible record of everything that has ever passed it, but this record cannot, so far as we yet know, be recovered from it so as to be visible to the ordinary physical senses. Though the more developed sense of the psychometrist perceives it without difficulty. How is it possible, men ask, for an inanimate particle to register and reproduce impressions? The answer is that the particle is not inanimate, and that the life which ensouls it is part of the divine life. Indeed, another way in which one may attempt to describe the record is to say that it is the memory of the Logos himself. And that each particle is somehow in touch with that part of that memory which includes the events which have taken place in its neighborhood, or what we may call within sight of it. It is probable that what we call our memory is nothing but a similar power of coming into touch, though often very imperfectly, with that part of his memory which refers to events which we happen to have seen or known. So we might say that every man carries about with him on the physical plane two memories of anything which he has seen, his brain memory, which is often imperfect or inaccurate, and the memory enshrined in any unchanged particles of his body or of the clothes that he wears, which is always perfect and accurate, but is available only for those who have learnt how to read it. Remember also that the brain memory may be inaccurate, not only because it is itself imperfect, but because the original observation may have been defective. Also that it may have been colored by prejudice. We see, to a large extent, what we wish to see, and we can remember an event only as it appeared to us, though we may have seen it partially or wrongly. But from all these defects the record is entirely free. It is obvious that a man's physical body can have neither a memory nor a record of a past incarnation in which it did not participate. And the same is true of his astral and mental bodies, since all these vehicles are new for each new incarnation. This at once shows us that the lowest level at which we can hope to get really reliable information about past lives is that of the causal body, for nothing below that can give us first-hand evidence. In those previous lives the ego in his causal body was present, at least a certain small part of him was, and so he is an actual witness, whereas all lower vehicles were not witnesses, and can only report what they have received from him. When we recollect how imperfect is the communication between the ego and the personality in the ordinary man, we shall at once see how entirely unreliable such second, third, or fourth-hand testimony is likely to be. One may sometimes obtain from the astral or mental bodies isolated pictures of events in a man's past life, but not a sequential and coherent account of it. And even those pictures are but reflections from the causal body, and probably very dim and blurred reflections. Therefore to read past lives with accuracy the first thing necessary is to develop the faculties of the causal body. Turning those faculties upon the causal body of the man to be examined, we have before us the same two possibilities as in the case of the physical man. We can take the ego's own memory of what happened, or we can as it were psychometrize him and see for ourselves the experiences through which he has passed. The latter method is the safer, for even the ego, since he has seen these things through a past personality, may have imperfect or prejudiced impressions of them. This then is the mechanism of the ordinary method of investigating past lives, to use the faculties of one's own causal body, and by its means to psychometrize the causal body of the subject. The thing could be done at lower levels by psychometrization of the permanent atoms, but as this would be a much more difficult feat than the unfolding of the senses of the causal body, it is not at all likely ever to be attempted successfully. Another method, which, however, requires much higher development, is to use the Buddhic faculties, to become absolutely one with the ego under investigation, and read his experiences as though they were one's own, from within instead of from without. Both of these methods have been employed by those who prepared the series of lives which appear in the Theosophist, and the investigators have also had the advantage of the intelligent cooperation of the ego whose incarnations are described. The physical presence of the subject whose lives are being read is an advantage, but not a necessity. He is useful if he can keep his vehicles perfectly calm, but if he becomes excited he spoils everything. The surroundings are not specially important, but quiet is essential, as the physical brain must be calm if impressions are to be brought through clearly. Everything which comes down to the physical level from the causal body must pass through the mental and the astral vehicles, and if either of these is disturbed it reflects imperfectly. Just as the least rippling of the surface of a lake will break up or distort the images of the trees or houses upon its banks. It is necessary also to eradicate absolutely all prejudices, otherwise they will produce the effect of stained glass. They will color everything which is seen through them, and so give a false impression. In looking at past lives it has always been our custom to retain full physical consciousness, so as to be able to make a note of everything while it is being observed. This is found to be a much safer method than to leave the physical body during the observations, and then trust to memory for their reproduction. There is however a stage at which this latter plan is the only one available, when the student, though able to use the causal body, can do so only while the physical vehicle is asleep. The identification of the various characters encountered in these glimpses of the past sometimes presents a little difficulty, for naturally egos change considerably in the course of 20,000 years or so. Fortunately, with a little practice it is possible to pass the record in review as rapidly or as slowly as may be desired. So when there is any doubt as to identification, we always adopt the plan of running quickly along the line of lives of the ego under observation, until we trace him to the present day. Some investigators, when they see an ego in some remote life, at once feel an intuition as to his present personality. But though such a flash of intuition may often be right, it may certainly also sometimes be wrong, and the more laborious method is the only one which is thoroughly reliable. There are cases in which even after many thousands of years the egos of ordinary people are instantly recognizable, but that does not speak particularly well for them, because it means that during all that time they have made but little progress. To try to recognize 20,000 years ago someone whom one knows at the present day is rather like meeting as an adult someone whom one knew long ago as a little child. In some cases recognition is possible. In other cases the change has been too great. Those who have since become masters of the wisdom are often instantly recognizable, even thousands of years ago, but that is for a very different reason. When the lower vehicles are already fully in harmony with the ego, they form themselves in the likeness of the ogoids, and so change very little from life to life. In the same way, when the ego himself is becoming a perfect reflection of the monad, he also changes but little, but gradually grows, and so he is readily recognizable. In examining a past life, the easiest way of all would be to let the record drift past us at its natural rate, but that would mean a day's work to look up the events of each day, and a lifetime spent upon each incarnation. As has been said, it is possible to accelerate or retard the passage of events, so that a period of thousands of years may be run through rapidly, or on the other hand any particular picture may be held as long as is desired, so that it may be examined in detail. The acceleration or retardation may perhaps be compared to the hastening or slackening of the movement of a panorama. A little practice gives the power to do this at will, but as in the case of the panorama, the whole record is really there all the time. What I have described as the unrolling of the record rapidly or slowly at will is in reality a movement not of the record, but of the consciousness of the seer. But the impression which it gives is exactly as I have stated it. The records may be said to lie upon one another in layers, the more recent on the top and the older ones behind. Yet even this simile is misleading, because it inevitably suggests the idea of thickness, whereas these records occupy no more space than does the reflection on the surface of a mirror. When the consciousness passes through them, it does not really move in space at all, it rather puts on itself, as a kind of cloak, one or other of the layers of the record, and in doing so it finds itself in the midst of the action of the story. One of the most tiresome tasks connected with this branch of inquiry is the determination of exact dates. In fact, some investigators frankly decline to undertake it, saying that it is not worth the trouble, and that a round number is sufficient for all practical purposes. Probably it is. Yet there is a feeling of satisfaction in getting even details as accurate as possible, even at the cost of tedious counting up to very high numbers. Our plan is of course to establish certain fixed points and then use those as a basis for further calculation. One such fixed point is the date 9564 BC, when the sinking of Poseidonis took place. Another is the date 75,025 BC. For the commencement of the great previous catastrophe. In the course of the investigation of the lives of Alcyone we have thus established a number of points, up to the date of 22,662 BC. And as those lives were worked backwards, and the intervals were therefore counted one by one and not all at once, the scheme was not too insufferably tedious, as it certainly would be with very large numbers. In certain cases astronomical means are also employed. A description of these different methods will be found in my book on clairvoyance. It is on the whole somewhat easier to read lives forwards than backwards, because in that case we are working with the natural flow of time instead of against it. So the usual plan is to run rapidly to some selected point in the past, and then work slowly forwards from that. It must be remembered that at first sight it is rarely possible to estimate accurately the relative importance of the minor events of a life, so we often skim over it first, to see from what actions or occurrences the really important changes flow. And then go back and describe those more in detail. If the investigator himself happens to be one of the characters in the life which he is examining, there opens before him the interesting alternative of actually putting himself back into that old personality, and feeling over again just what he felt in that ancient time. But in that case he sees everything exactly as he saw it then, and knows no more than he knew then. Few of those who read the life stories, which are often somewhat meager outlines, will have any conception of the amount of labor which has been bestowed upon them, of the hours of work which have sometimes been given to the full comprehension of some trifling detail, so that the picture finally presented may be as nearly a true one as is possible. At least our readers may be sure that no pains have been spared to ensure accuracy. Though this is often no easy task when we are dealing with conditions and modes of thought as entirely different from our own as though they belonged to another planet. The languages employed are almost always unintelligible to the investigator, but as the thoughts behind the words lie open before him that matters little. On several occasions those who were doing the work have copied down public inscriptions which they could not understand, and have afterwards had them translated on the physical plane by someone to whom the ancient language was familiar. A vast amount of work is represented by the sets of lives which are now appearing. May that labor bring its fruit in a more vivid realization of the mighty civilizations of the past and a clearer comprehension of the working of the laws of karma and reincarnation. Since the first set of lives which appeared have culminated in the initiation of the hero in his present incarnation, they are surely a valuable study for those whose aspiration is to become the pupils of a master of the wisdom. For their own progress should be the more rapid when they have learned how a brother has attained the goal towards which they are striving. This progress has been made the more easy for them because that brother has taken the trouble to record for us in that most admirable little book at the feet of the Master the teachings which led him to that goal. About 150 of those who are at present members of the Theosophical Society are the prominent characters in the drama which lies before the readers of the Theosophist. And it is deeply interesting to note how those who in the past have often been linked by the ties of blood relationship, though born this time in countries thousands of miles apart, are yet brought together by their common interest in theosophical study, and bound to one another more closely by their love for the masters than they could ever have been by any mere earthly connection. There are two sources of possible error in examining the records clairvoyantly: first, personal bias, and secondly, limited views. There are fundamental differences of temperament, and these cannot but color the views taken of other planes. The adept has a perfect perception of life, but below that level we are sure to have some prejudices. The man of the world magnifies unimportant details and omits all the important things, because he is in the habit of doing that in daily life. But on the other hand, a man starting on the path may, in his enthusiasm, lose for a time his touch with the ordinary human life from which he has emerged. Even then he has made a great advance, for those who see the inside of things are nearer to the truth than those who see only the outside. The statements of clairvoyance may and must be colored by opinions already formed, as was clearly the case with Swedenborg, who used a very narrow Christian terminology to describe the facts of the astral plane, and unquestionably saw many things through strong thought forms which he had made in previous years. He started with certain definite preconceptions, and he made everything which he saw fit into those preconceptions. You know how it is possible down here on the physical plane to start with some preconception about a man and distort his most innocent words and actions to fit that preconception, to read into them ideas of which the unfortunate man never even dreamt. The same thing is possible on the astral plane if one is careless. Theosophical investigators are thoroughly on their guard against this danger of personal bias, and use constant checks of all kinds to avoid it. To minimize the chance of error from this source, the masters usually select people of radically different types to work together. Secondly, there is the danger of a limited view, of taking a part for the whole. For example, there has been much said of the corruption and black magic of later days in Poseidonies, but there existed there, at that very time, a secret society that was quite pure and had high aims. If it had happened that we had seen only this society, we might easily have thought of Poseidonis as a most spiritual country. It is possible, you see, that such limited views may be taken as applying to a whole region or community. Generalizations must be checked and verified. There is, however, a general aura of a time or a country, which usually prevents any great mistakes of this sort. A psychic who has not been trained to sense this general aura is often unconscious of it, and thus the untrained man falls into many errors. In fact, long-continued observation shows that all untrained psychics are sometimes reliable and sometimes unreliable, and those who consult them always run a risk of being misled. The records must not be thought of as originally inhering in matter of any kind, though they are reflected in it. In order to read them, it is not necessary to come into direct contact with any particular grouping of matter, since they can be read from any distance, when a connection has once been made. Nevertheless, it is also true that each atom retains the record, or perhaps only possesses the power to put a clairvoyant en rapport with the record, of all that has ever happened within sight of it. It is by means of this quality that psychometry is possible. But there is this very curious limitation attached to it, that the normal psychometer sees by means of it only what he would have seen if he had been standing at the spot from which the object psychometrized has been taken. For example, if a man psychometrizes a pebble which has been lying for ages in a valley, he will see only what has passed during those ages in that valley. His views will be limited by the surrounding hills, just as if he had stood for all those ages where the stone lay, and had witnessed all those things. True, there is an extension of the psychometric power, by which a man may see the thoughts and feelings of the actors in his drama as well as their physical bodies, and there is also another extension by which, having first established himself in that valley, he may make it the basis of further operations, and so pass over the surrounding hills and see what lies beyond them, and also what has happened there since the stone was removed. And even what occurred before it in some manner arrived there. But the man who can do that will soon be able to dispense with the stone altogether. When we use the senses of the causal body on the counterparts of physical things, we see that every object is thus throwing off pictures of the past. As we develop our inner consciousness and faculties, our life becomes a continuous one. We reach the consciousness of the ego, and then we can travel back even as far as the group soul in which we lived the animal stage of our life. And look through animal eyes at the human beings of that period and the different world that flourished then. But there are no words to tell what is seen in that way, for the difference of outlook is beyond all expression. Short of that continuous consciousness, however, there is no detailed memory, not even of the most important facts. For example, a person who knows the truth of reincarnation in one life does not necessarily carry his certainty over to the next. I forgot it myself, and so did Mrs. Besant. I did not know anything of it in this life, until I heard of it from outside, and then I instantly recognized its truth. Whatever we have known in the past will spring up in the mind in this way as a certainty when it is next presented before us. As a child I used constantly to dream of a certain house, which I afterwards learned was a house which I had lived in a previous life. It was quite unlike any with which I was at that time familiar on the physical plane, for it was built round a central courtyard, with a fountain and statues and shrubs, into which all the rooms looked. I used to dream of it perhaps 3 times a week, and I knew every room of it and all the people who lived in it, and used constantly to describe it to my mother, and make ground plans of it. We called it my dream house. As I grew older I dreamt of it less and less frequently, until at last it faded from my memory altogether. But one day, to illustrate some point, my master showed me a picture of the house in which I had lived in my last incarnation, and I recognized it immediately. Anyone may intellectually appreciate the necessity of reincarnation. But actually to prove it one must become, in the causal body, cognizant of the past and future. The only way of casting off the fetter of doubt is by knowledge and intelligent comprehension. Blind belief is a barrier to progress, but this does not mean that we are wrong in accepting intelligently the statements of those who know more than ourselves. There are no authoritative dogmas which must be accepted in the Theosophical Society. There are only statements of the results of investigation, which are offered in the belief that they will be as helpful to other minds as they have been to the investigators. Foreseeing the future. It is very difficult to explain how the future is foreseen, but there is no doubt whatever as to the fact. Apart from apparently accidental pictures and flashes of intuition, often effective but not under control, there are two ways in which the future may definitely be foreseen by means of the higher clairvoyance. One is quite readily explicable and comprehensible, the other is not explicable at all. Even with only physical senses we may see enough to foretell certain things. If, for instance, we see a man leading an extravagant life of debauchery, we may safely predict that, unless he changes, he will presently lose both health and fortune. What we cannot tell by physical means is whether he will change or not. But a man who has the sight of the causal body could often tell this, because to him the reserve forces of the other would be visible, he could see what the ego thought of it all, and whether he was strong enough to interfere. No merely physical prediction is certain, because so many of the causes which influence life cannot be seen on this lower plane. But when we raise our consciousness to higher planes we can see more of the causes, and so can come much nearer to calculating the effects. Obviously, if all the causes could be perfectly seen and judged, all their results would be readily calculable. Perhaps none but the Logos can see all causes in his system, but an adept would surely be able to see all that could affect an ordinary man. So it is probable that by this method an adept could foretell the life of that man quite accurately. For the ordinary man has little willpower, karma assigns to him certain surroundings, and he is the creature of those surroundings. He accepts the fate marked out for him, because he does not know that he can alter it. A more developed man takes hold of his destiny and molds it, he makes his future what he wills it to be, counteracting the karma of the past by setting fresh forces in motion. So his future is not so easily predicable. But no doubt even in this case an adept, who could see the latent will, could also calculate how he would use it. That method of foretelling the future is entirely comprehensible, and it is clear that the chief events of any life could be prophesied along that line. But there is another way for which we cannot so easily account. One has only to raise the consciousness to a plane sufficiently high, to find the limitation which we call time disappearing, and the past, present and future spread out before us like an open book. How that can be reconciled with our freedom of action I am not prepared to say, but I can testify that the fact is so. When this sight is employed the future is simply there, down to the minutest detail. I believe myself that we are free to choose, though only within certain limits, yet a power, far higher than we, may well know how we shall choose. You know what your dog will do under certain conditions, but that does not in the least make him do it, so a power as much higher than man, as man is than the dog, may know quite well how man will use his fragment of free will. For it is only a fragment, the plan of the Logos is to trust us with a little freedom, and see how we use it. If we use it well and wisely, a little more is given to us. And so long as we continue to use it in harmony with his great intention of evolution, we shall find more and more freedom of choice coming to us. But if we are so foolish as to use it selfishly, so as to bring harm to ourselves and hinder his plan, we shall find ourselves cramped in our action and forced back into line. A child must have freedom to walk, even though that involves a risk of falling, or else he will never learn, but no one would let him make his experiment on the edge of a precipice. So we have freedom enough to do ourselves a little harm if we use it wrongly, but no freedom enough to destroy ourselves altogether. Times of choice certainly come to us, but between those times we have often little option. When we have made our choice we must abide by its consequences. Looked at from above, human destiny seems rather like a network of railway lines. A man starts out on a locomotive, and chooses his line of rail. But when he has chosen it he must run along it, and cannot swerve to the right hand or the left until he reaches the first set of points. Then he may descend and set the points as he will, but having once set them and started on his way he must accept the consequences of his decision. He has no power to turn aside until the next point of choice comes in his way. We must not confuse free will with freedom of action. Now to possess fully the power of forecasting the future by either of the methods described means considerable development. But isolated pictures reflected from both of them may often be had at very much lower levels. What is called in Scotland second sight appears to be an example. By that, a future event is often seen with quite a wealth of detail. I remember reading of a case where a seer told a skeptic that a certain man known to them both would die at a given time, and furthermore gave a detailed description of his funeral, mentioning the pallbearers by name. The skeptic ridiculed the whole prediction, but when the appointed time came the man indicated did die as had been prophesied. The skeptic was astonished, but still more annoyed, and he determined that the rest of the story should not come true, for he himself would interfere to falsify it. He therefore got himself appointed as one of the pallbearers. But when the day came and the party was just about to start, he was called aside for a moment, and when he returned he found that the procession had already moved away, and that the pallbearers were those who had been seen in the vision. I have myself had similar pictures of scenes in the future, scenes of no interest to myself, and of no use so far as I could see. But they have always happened exactly as I had seen them, in every case where I have had the opportunity of verifying them. The Logos has thought out the whole life of his system, not only as it is now, but as it has been at every moment in the past, and as it will be at every moment in the future. And his thought calls into existence that of which he thinks. These thought forms are said to be on the cosmic mental plane, 2 whole sets of 7 planes above our set of 7. He thinks out what he intends each of the planetary chains to do. He comes down to smaller details, for he thinks of the type of man for every root race and sub-race, from the beginning of all, through the Lemurian, the Atlantean, the Aryan and the succeeding races. Thus we may say that on that cosmic mental plane the whole of the system was called into existence simultaneously by that thought, an act of special creation, and it must all be now simultaneously present to him. So that it may well be that his mighty consciousness to some extent reflects itself even on very much lower levels, and somehow we sometimes catch faint glimpses of those reflections. Fifth section, Devas and Nature Spirits. The Aura of the Deva. The Devas are a mighty kingdom of spirits, the next above humanity, just in the same way as the animal kingdom is the next one below it. You may think of them as great and glorious angels, but of course they are of many different kinds, and different degrees of evolution. None of them are so low down as to have physical bodies such as we have. The lowest kind are called Kamadevas, and they have astral bodies, while the next higher variety have bodies made of lower mental matter, and so on. They will never be human, because most of them are already beyond that stage, but there are some of them who have been human beings in the past. When men come to the end of their evolution as men, and become something greater than human, several paths open before them and one of these is to join this beautiful Deva evolution. Devas and men differ in appearance. For one thing Devas are more fluidic, capable of far greater expansion and contraction. Secondly, they have a certain fiery quality which is clearly distinguishable from that of any ordinary human being. The only kind of human being with whom it might be possible to confound them would be the highly developed, an Arhat, for example, who had a large and well-arranged aura, but even then one who had seen both would not be likely to mistake them. The aura of the ordinary man is capable of a certain amount of temporary expansion. It has a definite size, which is the same as that of a section of the causal body, and as the causal body grows, that section becomes larger, and the man has a larger aura, but such increase comes only gradually. If you remember the plates in man visible and invisible, you will recollect that the ordinary man, as far as the causal body is concerned, is far from being fully developed. When you look at the causal body of the developed man, you will see that it is full of color, so the first stages of improvement in the case of the ordinary man consists in its filling up, not its enlargement. He must get the ovoid filled with different colors, and then expansion begins. If any sudden rush of feeling comes over the ordinary man, it shows itself, as depicted in the book, by the flashing in the aura, and out from it, of the color of the quality expressed, rose for affection, blue for devotion or green for sympathy. And also in the pulsating bands of that color, and in the general intensification of everything connected with that emotion. It does not do more than that for the ordinary man. An exceedingly vivid rush of affection, for example, fills the aura with rose and sends out thought forms of that color in the direction of its object, but it does not usually appreciably increase, even temporarily, the size of the aura. The developed man, however, has already filled the causal body with color. So in his case the effect produced by such a rush of affection or devotion or sympathy is not only to suffuse the body with color and cause a great outrush of thought forms, but also to produce a considerable temporary expansion. Though the aura afterwards contracts to its normal size. Each such outrush of feeling makes the aura permanently just a little larger than before. The more it increases, the more power the man has to feel. Intellectual development also increases the aura, but in that case yellow is the predominant color. Remember that utterly unselfish affection or devotion belongs not to the astral but to the Buddhic plane, and that is why when a wave of such feeling rushes over a man it causes great temporary expansion of his aura. Yet it never increases to the same tremendous extent as with a deva. The fluctuations in the aura of a deva are so great as to be startling to those who are not used to them. One who recently did us the honor to pay us a visit at Udyar, to give us information about the foundation of the sixth root race, had normally an aura of about 150 yards in diameter. But when he became interested in the teaching which he was giving to us, that aura increased until it reached the sea, which is about a mile away from us. No human being could feel sufficient emotion to produce such an increase as this. Even in the case of a master the proportionate temporary enlargement would never be so great. I do not mean anything derogatory to the deva, when I say that the master is steadier, and that the permanent growth of his aura would be as great as that of the deva, but the temporary expansion less in proportion. The texture of the deva's aura is, as it were, looser. The same extent of aura in a human being contains more matter, because it is more condensed or concentrated. The deva in question was no further advanced than an arhat, whose aura might probably extend a third of the distance. But it might easily happen that a clairvoyant who had not seen either before might realize only that he was surrounded by a cloud of glory in either case, and he probably would not know the difference. Expansion and growth take place in the astral and mental bodies as well as in the causal. These three bodies are all of the same extent, although you must remember one is dealing with only sections, and even sections of sections. There used to be a theory afloat that the causal body of the ordinary was about the size of a pea, and that it gradually increased, but that is not correct. The undeveloped causal body is the same size as any other, until the expansion begins. As I have said, the aura of a deva has fiery characteristics which are not easy to describe, though very readily recognizable. All of the colors are more fluidic, and of the nature of flame rather than of cloud. A man looks like an exceedingly brilliant, yet delicate cloud of glowing gas, but a deva looks like a mass of fire. The human form inside the aura of a deva is very much less defined than in a man. He lives more in the circumference, more all over his aura than a man does. 99% of the matter of a man's aura is within the periphery of the physical body, but the proportion is far less in the case of a deva. Devas usually appear as human beings of gigantic size. Somebody has suggested that there are devas who look as though they were feathered. There is some justification for this idea. I know exactly the appearance that man was trying to describe, but it is not easy to put it into words. The great green devas whom I saw in Ireland have a very striking appearance, being enormous in size and most majestic. One cannot describe them accurately, in words it is only possible to approximate. The painters usually represent angels with wings and feathers, but I think where these are mentioned in the Christian scriptures they are always symbolical, for when real angels appear they are sometimes mistaken for human beings, as by Abraham. For example. So obviously they could not have had wings. In many cases a deva may be distinguished by the form which he happens to be taking inside his ovoid. It is nearly always a human form. You remember that nature spirits take human form almost invariably, but with a peculiarity of some sort, always a little odd. I should be disposed to say the same of the devas. But it would be wrong to think of their forms as in any way distorted, for they have a great dignity and majesty. The devas produce thought forms as we do, but theirs are not usually so concrete as ours until they reach a high level. They have a wide generalizing nature, and are constantly making gorgeous plans. They have a color language, which is probably not as definite as our speech, though in certain ways it may express more. As regards the size of the aura, that of an ordinary man extends about 18 inches on each side of the body. If he puts his elbow against his side and stretches out his arm and hand, his fingertips will be near the circumference. The average theosophist may be a trifle larger than the quite uninterested person, but there are fine, large auras outside the society as well. Intense feeling means a larger aura. We may have a distortion of the aura, it may be a little out of shape. As I have explained before, most people have the small end of the egg upwards, but we who are students tend to grow larger at the top. Because the characteristics which we are developing express themselves in matter which naturally floats in the upper part of the aura because of its specific gravity. The increased size of the aura is a prerequisite for initiation, and the qualifications should be visible in it. The aura of a Buddha is said in the books to be 3 miles in radius. At one stage below his, I have myself seen one which extends about 2 miles. It naturally increases with each initiation. The devas do not come along our line of development, and do not take such initiations as we do, for the two kingdoms converge at a point higher than the adept. There are ways in which a man can enter the deva evolution, even at our own stage, or lower. You ask if the devas are often near at hand and willing to teach men. They are usually quite willing to expound and exemplify subjects along their own line to any human being who is sufficiently developed to appreciate them. Much instruction is being given in this way. But most people have not prepared themselves for it yet, and so are unable to profit by it. We know nothing of any rule or limit for the work of the devas, they have more lines of activity than we can imagine. There are usually plenty of them here at Udyar. We have many great advantages here, where the masters come so frequently. In order to see them, all that is required is a little clairvoyance at the right moment. There is a stimulus from these beings, which some feel in one way and some in others. Perhaps in the earlier incarnation of the Lord Gautama as the first Zoroaster, the fire which is one of the signs of his development may have been one of the reasons why he was mistaken for a deva. It is said that during meditation flames leapt from the aura of the Lord Buddha, but we must remember that an ordinary thought form would often appear flame-like to a person who was not used to such things. The shining of the Christ at the Transfiguration is a similar case. There are plenty of glorious influences all around us here, but their effect upon each one of us can be in proportion to his receptivity. We can take from all this just what we make ourselves fit to take, and no more. A person who is thinking of himself all the while may bathe in this glowing magnetism for a year, and not be one iota the better for it. He may even be the worse. For these tremendously strong vibrations tend to intensify a man's qualities, and sometimes the undesirable are strengthened as well as the desirable, or he may be altogether upset, and become unbalanced and hysterical. To a man who is wise enough to take it, a stay at Udyar is an opportunity such as few men have ever had during history, but what we make of it depends entirely upon ourselves. The spirit of a tree. The spirit of a great tree, such as a banyan, not infrequently externalizes itself, and when it does so it usually takes on a gigantic human form. I have noticed one near here, for example, whose form is about 12 feet high, and looked like a woman the last time I saw it. Its features were quite clear, but its form was misty. There are also nature spirits which cling round a tree, and do not at all like to be disturbed. I have heard it said that nature spirits do not cling round the trees which man fells for timber. But such observations as I have been able to make do not bear out this contention, and it seems to me that it must have been invented by men who wish to destroy the tree without feeling any unpleasant twinges of conscience. Although it takes so fine a form, the spirit of a tree is not individualized, nor even within measurable distance of individualization. Nevertheless, it is already much higher than the lower forms of animal life, and when it passes into the animal kingdom it will come straight into some of the mammalian groups. It has its likes and dislikes, and these show in its aura, though the color and definition are naturally altogether vaguer and dimmer than in the case of an animal. Indeed, in animals who glow with affection its color is often remarkably strong. Stronger in the case of some animals than that which is shown by some human beings, because it is so much more concentrated and one-pointed. The strong attraction which some people feel for particular kinds of trees or animals depends often upon the line of animal and vegetable evolution through which those people have risen. Sixth section, the worlds and the races of men. The building of the system. Our solar system has 7 planes which, when taken together, form the lowest of the great cosmic planes. There was a time when this cosmic plane consisted only of what was to it atomic matter, that is to say, of the bubbles in Koilan. That was the condition existing on what we may call the site of the solar system. When the solar logos chose to manifest himself, when he came forth out of eternity into time, and wished to form this system, he commenced first of all by defining an area, the limit perhaps of his own aura. Within that area he began his work upon the bubbles in Koilan, which seem to have been already constructed, probably by some still greater logos, using them as the atoms of our highest plane, and creating the universe in 7 breaths. For example, he did not make the physical plane matter directly from the astral plane matter, but withdrew into himself some of the matter of the astral plane and then breathed it out again in a new combination. Thus there is what is sometimes called a fresh tanmatra as well as a fresh tattva for each plane. The shortest and clearest definition of these words which I have ever heard was given by the late T. Subba Rao. He said, "The tanmatra is the modification in the consciousness of the logos, and the tattva is the effect produced in matter by that modification. You have seen how on a sandy shore a little wave comes quietly in, runs up on the sand and retires. But it has left behind it a tiny ridge to mark its limit. If the tide is rising, the next wave which comes in goes a little further up the beach, makes its mark in turn and then retires. You may think of the tanmatra as imaged by that wave, which is the temporary modification of the ocean, and you may think of the little ridge made in the sand as symbolizing the tattva. The meaning of the word tattva appears to be thatness, or inherent quality. Though the atoms of the various planes as we descend are thus not made directly from one another, it is nevertheless true that the atoms of the lower planes could not be made as they are unless the bubbles of which they are composed had already had the experience of passing through all the others above. The atom of the second plane already consists of 49 of these bubbles, and the atom of the third or nirvanic plane of 2401. This proportion persists all the way down, so that the same energy which makes 49 astral atoms makes only one physical atom, the bubbles being arranged differently. If we could take a physical atom and put it back plane by plane up to the highest, it would be found to consist of about 14,000 million of these bubbles. But when the logos is making the planes, the matter of one plane is drawn up and disintegrated down to the original bubbles, and then recombined to make the matter of the next lower plane. It is probable that the force by which some greater logos formed the bubbles in Koilan is what Madame Blavatsky calls fohat, for you remember that is spoken of as digging holes in space, and the holes may be these infinitesimal bubbles. Instead of solar systems, as we at first supposed. I do not know whether each bubble is rotating round its own axis or not. Remember, it is not like a soap bubble, which is a film of water with an outer and inner surface, enclosing air inside it. It is like a bubble in soda water, which has only one surface, where the air meets the water. To the highest sight that we can as yet bring to bear upon it, it appears to be absolutely empty, so we cannot tell whether there is any interior motion going on in it or not. It seems to have no proper motion of its own, but it can be moved as a whole from without, singly or en masse, by an exertion of the will. No two of these bubbles ever under any circumstances touch each other. The drawing of the physical atom which is given in the frontispiece to the ancient wisdom is not quite accurate, it is far too flat, too much like a locket in appearance. The drawing given in occult chemistry is far better. The atom in reality is nearly globular, and its projecting points lie almost on the surface of a sphere. It looks somewhat like a wire cage, composed of 10 endless wires, which lie completely separate and never touch one another, that is, if any one of them were taken out and uncoiled, and laid out flat, it would be a circle. The arrangement is rather complicated, and a diagram is necessary in order to make it clear. A model would be still better, but no one has yet had the time or the patience to make one. By reference to the illustration in occult chemistry, it will be seen that 3 of these 10 wires are thicker than the rest, for in them the 7 sets of spirally do not fit accurately over one another, as they do in the other wires. Because in every 700 turns there are 4 more atoms. This means an increase of 1 in every 175 bubbles, and it is this which makes those 3 seem larger than the rest. A scientific man, in criticizing the Koilon article, said that in dealing with such minute particles it was impossible to be so accurate, but that is only because he did not understand that it is a mere question of counting in comparison. The atom has 3 movements of its own: 1, rotation on its axis; 2, an orbital motion, for it is continually running round in a small circle; 3, a pulsation like a heart, a constant expansion and contraction. These 3 movements are always going on, and are unaffected by any force from outside. A force from outside, a ray of light for example, will set the atom as a whole moving violently up and down, the phase of this movement being proportional to the intensity of the light, and its wavelength being determined by the color of the light. A curious feature is that when this happens, one of the 7 minor wires of the atom begins to glow, the which corresponds to the color of the light which is setting the whole atom in motion. The atom exists because of the force which the logos is pouring through it, precisely as a little revolving column of dust and leaves, at the corner of the street, exists because of the whirling wind which made it. The existence of matter depends therefore absolutely upon the continuance of an idea in the mind of the logos. If he chose to withdraw his force from the physical plane, to cease thinking it, every physical atom would instantly disintegrate, and the whole physical plane would disappear in an instant like the light of a candle when it is blown out. Besides this force which holds the atom together in its spiral form, a number of the forces of the logos are also playing round its coils, or perhaps we should rather say, one of his forces is playing at a number of different levels. There are 7 orders of this force, which are eventually, at the end of the 7th round, to play fully round the 7 sets of spirally, but some of them are not yet in activity, since this is only the 4th round. There is some reason to believe that what the scientific people call electrons may be what we call astral atoms. For they have said that in a chemical atom of hydrogen there are probably somewhere between 700 and 1,000 of these electrons. Now it happens that in a chemical atom of hydrogen there are 882 astral atoms. This may of course be only a coincidence, but that seems somewhat improbable. If this suggestion be true, it follows that in some of their experiments our scientific men must be actually disintegrating physical matter, and throwing it back on to the astral plane. In which case it would seem that they must presently be forced to admit the existence of astral matter, though they will naturally think of it as nothing but a further subdivision of physical matter. I do not know whether in such cases the disintegrated physical atoms reform themselves. But in our experiments, when by an effort of the will the physical atom is broken up into astral or mental atoms, it means only that for a moment the human will is set against the divine will which formed that atom. It requires a distinct effort to hold the atom temporarily in a different form, and the moment that the human will is withdrawn the divine will reasserts itself and the physical atom is there once more. This, however, seems to apply only to the breaking up of the ultimate atoms of the plane. When for experimental purposes we break up a chemical atom into physical ultimate atoms, it remains in that condition, and does not return to its original state. In interstellar space, between solar systems, we are given to understand that atoms lie far apart and equidistant, and I believe that that is their normal condition when undisturbed. That is what is meant by speaking of the atoms as free. Within the atmosphere of a planet they are never found in at all that state, for even when not grouped in forms, they are at any rate enormously compressed by the force of attraction. A man has a causal body on the atomic mental plane, but the mental atoms composing it will be crushed together by attraction into a very definite and quite dense shape, even though they are in no way altered in themselves, and are not grouped into molecules. Such a body could exist comfortably on its own atomic plane in the neighborhood of a planet, where the atomic matter is in the compressed condition. But it would not at all be able to move or function in this faraway space where the atoms remain absolutely free and uncompressed. The conditions in interplanetary space are probably not exactly the same as in interstellar space, for there may be a great deal of disturbance due to cometic and meteoric matter. And also the tremendous attraction of the Sun produces a considerable compression within the limits of his system. Indeed, the vortex made in the first place by the Logos is of course still in action, and part of its action was to draw in matter from the surrounding space and compress it. I have no information upon the question as to whether atoms floating within the limits of the solar system would or would not be necessarily all vivified by elemental essence. It seems to me most probable, however, that only those atoms which make the mental, astral and physical bodies, the latter of course, including the atmosphere and the lower varieties of ether, of the Sun and the various planets and comets would be so vivified. At any rate, as we began by saying, the Logos chooses his area, an area of size stupendous beyond our comprehension. Astronomy tells us that the distance between solar systems is so enormous as to be out of all proportion to the systems themselves. It is nevertheless probable that the logoi of those systems are actually in touch with one another, and that the solar system existing in the center of each of these inconceivably vast spheres represents the condensation of matter which was originally scattered throughout the whole of that prodigious area. In a condition of the minutest possible subdivision, perhaps in the condition of the ultimate bubbles which are atoms of our highest plane. At a certain stage in that condensation or compressed, a stage when the radius of his globe still extends far beyond the orbit of the outermost planet of our system as it is today, he sets up within it a whirling motion accompanied by intense electrical action, thus making a kind of colossal vortex in many dimensions. The compression of the whirling mass is continued through what to us would be untold ages, in the course of which he breathes the 7 breaths of which we have previously spoken, and thereby groups the bubbles into the atomic matter of the various planes. Eventually there comes a point at which he sends through it a kind of electrical shock, which precipitates it into a lower condition of matter, so that instead of being a mere aggregation of atoms it becomes definitely a combination of them. Usually a mass of glowing hydrogen. Here we have the nebular stage, through which various systems in our universe are at this moment passing, as may be seen by means of any large telescope. As our nebula revolved round its axis it gradually cooled, contracted and flattened down, so that eventually it became rather a huge revolving disk than a sphere. Presently fissures appeared in this disk and it broke into rings, presenting somewhat the appearance of the planet Saturn and its surroundings, but on a gigantic scale. At a chosen point in each of these rings a subsidiary vortex was set up, and gradually much of the matter of the ring was gathered into this. The concussion of the fragments generated an amount of heat which reduced them to a gaseous condition and thus formed a huge glowing ball, which gradually, as it cooled, condensed into a planet. The planet formed upon the ring in this particular part of the system was, however, not the Earth but the Moon. We think of the Moon as the satellite of the Earth, comparing it in our minds with the satellites of Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn. But in reality the comparison is unfair, for the Moon is more companion planet than a satellite. No other satellite in the solar system bears at all the same proportion to its primary as the Moon does to the Earth, even though it is now much smaller than it used to be, as will be presently explained. It was the one physical planet of the lunar chain, and our present humanity inhabited it in the distant past, although we were then a stage further back, and were in the animal kingdom. The Earth came into existence when the active life of the Moon was already over. A new vortex was set up not far away from the Moon, and the rest of the matter of the ring was gradually gathered into it. The resultant collisions once more produced a ball of glowing gas, which enfolded the body of the Moon and very soon reduced it to a similar condition. As this combined mass gradually cooled, condensation took place round the two vortices, but by far the larger part of the matter was attracted to the new one which became the Earth, leaving the Moon a much smaller body than it had been and altogether denuded of air and water. The Moon was still, from the intense heat, in a plastic condition like hot mud, and the Earth in its earlier stages was subject to the most tremendous volcanic convulsions. In the course of these, enormous masses of rock, often many miles in diameter, were thrown up into space to vast distances in all directions. The majority of these fell back upon the Earth, but some of them struck the Moon while still in its plastic condition and produced upon it many of those huge depressions which we now call lunar craters. Anyone who will take the trouble of throwing a few small pebbles into mud at the right stage of consistency will find that he obtains in that way an effect precisely similar to that which we observe upon the surface of the Moon. Some of the lunar craters are really craters, but not many. The Moon is now like a vast cinder, hard but porous, of a consistency not unlike that of pumice stone, though harder. Hardly any physical action of any sort is now taking place upon the surface of the Moon. It is probably slowly disintegrating, and we are told that in the course of our 7th round it will break up altogether. And its matter will be used, with presumably some of our own, to build a new world which will be the only physical globe of the next incarnation of our chain. To that new globe whatever remains of the Earth will act as a satellite. The Moon has often been described in theosophical literature as the 8th sphere, because it is not one of the 7 planets of our chain upon which evolution is taking place. It is therefore what is called a dead end, a place where only refuse gathers, and it is a kind of a dust heap or waste paper basket to the system, a kind of astral cesspool into which are thrown decaying fragments of various sorts. Such as the lost personality which has torn itself away from the ego, who has allowed it to slip out of his grasp in the manner which I explained in the first volume of this book, in the article on Lost Soul. The planetary chains. Our solar system at the present moment contains 10 chains, each consisting of 7 globes, and these are evolving side by side, though at different stages. 7 of them are represented upon the physical level by 1 or more globes, but the 3 others exist only on higher levels. The number of globes on the physical plane which a chain has at any given time depends upon the stage of its evolution. The globes of each chain present us with a small cycle of evolution descending into denser matter and then ascending out of it. And in an exactly analogous manner the successive incarnations of a chain also descend into denser matter and then ascend out of it. Our own chain is at the present moment at its lowest level of materiality, so that of its 7 planets 3 are on the physical plane, 2 on the astral and 2 on the lower mental. We usually employ the letters of the alphabet to denote these globes in their order, so we should represent the present condition of affairs by saying that globes A and G are on the lower mental plane. Globes B and F on the astral, and globes C, D, and E upon the physical level, C and E being smaller than D. It will be observed that in traveling round the chain the life wave is steadily involving itself more and more in matter as it descends from A to D, but is rising again and casting off successive veils of matter as it passes from D to G. This is the condition of affairs during the 4th and most material incarnation of each chain. But in the 3rd and 5th incarnations each chain has its 1st and 7th planets on the higher mental, its 2nd and 6th on the lower mental, its 3rd and 5th on the astral, and only 1 planet, the 4th, on the physical plane. The 2nd and 6th incarnations of each chain are 1 stage higher. Their 4th planet is upon the astral plane, while the 3rd and 5th are upon the lower mental, the 2nd and 6th upon the higher mental and the 1st and 7th at the Buddhic level. The 1st and 7th incarnations of a chain are 1 stage higher still, in that their lowest planets are on the lower mental plane and their 1st and 7th planets at the stage which we call nirvanic. It is not easy for us to attach any meaning to the idea of a planet upon planes so exalted as the nirvanic or Buddhic, and we are perhaps scarcely justified in using the term. All that we mean is that there is a certain location in space where the evolution of certain groups of monads is taking place through agencies which work on those exalted levels. Each of these 70 planets may be regarded as having a definite location in space and as revolving round, or in some way depending upon, our Sun. Of these 70 planets only 12 are physical, and even of those 12 one is not yet recognized by science and 2 others have only lately been discovered. The existence of Vulcan was accepted by some astronomers a century ago, but as it cannot now be found, the scientific men of the present day hold that the earlier observations were incorrect. No astronomer had dreamt of the two planets beyond the orbit of Neptune at the time when they were first mentioned in theosophical writings. But now their existence is admitted in consequence of the deflections which they have produced in certain cometary orbits. Madame Blavatsky says that Neptune is not in our solar system, but there can be no question that it revolves round our Sun. Madame Blavatsky therefore must have been speaking in some occult or symbolical sense when she used those words. From the occult point of view also, the Neptunian chain is clearly part of our system, being one of the 10 chains which compose it, so we are unable at the moment to attach any meaning to Madame Blavatsky's statement. That does not in the least imply that it is really meaningless or inaccurate. We have frequently found that passages in her writings, which we had been for a long time compelled to put aside as incomprehensible and apparently contrary to known facts, had nevertheless a definite meaning and a certain sense in which they were true, though these were discoverable only when, by penetrating to higher planes, fresh aspects of the subject were brought into view. No doubt in due time this will prove to be the case with this enigmatical statement about Neptune. Besides those on the 70 planets of which we have spoken, there are other evolutions taking place, every inch of place being utilized. Even in the Koilon itself there may be an evolution going on of which we know nothing and can imagine nothing. We know as yet so little of this marvelous system to which we belong. All this teaching of theosophy which has so changed our lives is but the lifting of a tiny corner of the veil. All space is filled with life, and there are even lower orders than that of the physical plane. It sometimes happens that a human being comes into touch with that lower evolution, but that is always undesirable. Yet it would be a great mistake to speak of the inhabitants of this lower world as wicked. Certainly that evolution brings harm to us if we become entangled with it, but that is because it is not meant for us. Of the 7 chains that have physical planets, taking them in order, beginning with the nearest to the Sun and working outwards, we have first Vulcan, with only one physical planet, which is small and must be very hot. The Vulcan chain is in its 3rd incarnation, but we are given to understand that its scheme of evolution is not destined to bring the entities concerned with it to as high a level as will be ultimately attained by the inhabitants of our own planet. Mercury is the next planet, and belongs to the Earth chain. Venus is the only physical planet of the chain of which it is a part. It is in the 7th round of its 5th incarnation, and it represents the most advanced degree of evolution yet attained by humanity in this solar system. Being so far advanced, it has been able to afford assistance to other and less developed evolutions. From it, as we know, descended the Lords of the Flame, who gave so great a stimulus to the progress of humanity in the middle of our 3rd root race. It is a remarkable fact that the astronomers of 150 years ago recorded several observations of a satellite of Venus, whereas now it is quite certain that no such orb exists. The usual supposition is that those earlier astronomers erred. But this is scarcely likely in view of the number and character of the witnesses, and also their repeated observations. It was seen by astronomers as well known as Cassini and Short, in 1761, and that not once but many times, and with different telescopes. It was observed by Schutten during the whole of its transit along with Venus in the same year. It was seen 4 times by Montaigne, and again in 1764 by Rodquier, Horbeau and Montbarron. It was estimated to have a diameter of about 2,000 miles. It is surely more probable that all these astronomers were right in their observations, for we are told that in our 7th round the moon will disintegrate and we shall be left without a satellite. It may be only a coincidence that Venus is in its 7th round, but it is a curious one. The next planets are our Earth and Mars, and these two, along with Mercury, are the 3 physical planets of a chain which is in its 4th incarnation. Our Earth is the lowest and most material of the series, planet D, while Mars is our planet C and Mercury our planet E. A good many of the more advanced members of our present humanity were not upon the planet Mars when the life wave last swept over it, as will be explained later. But the great bulk of the human race has certainly passed through a series of incarnations on that planet, and we have left behind us many traces of our occupation, of which the present inhabitants are abundantly availing themselves. When our present occupancy of the earth ends for a time, we shall all pass on to the somewhat less material life of the planet Mercury, where the average level of consciousness may be somewhat more extended than it is here. Since ordinary humanity will then possess what is now called etheric sight. There are no grounds whatever, so far as I know, for the statement made by a recent writer that the real names of Mercury and Venus have been interchanged. Indeed, we know a great deal about these planets, which makes the idea inconceivable. Next come the asteroids, material which will make a world some time, but we do not count them now. The giant of the solar system, Jupiter, has a chain of its own. It is in an early stage of its evolution, being very much too hot for life, such as we know, to exist on its surface, but its satellites are inhabited. Its surface has seas of molten metals, and similar conditions exist on all the outside giant planets. It has a density about that of water, if you take the whole mass. But what we see is really the outside of a mass of cloud thousands of miles in depth, so we get a false estimate of the actual size of the planet itself. The Jupiter scheme is at present in the second round of its third incarnation. We are told that this system will eventually raise its humanity to an extremely high level. Next we come to Saturn, with its wonderful system of rings and satellites. It is the only physical planet of its chain. It also is in an early round of its third incarnation, and we understand that the development connected with it is slower than most of the others, but that it will ultimately reach exalted levels. As to the schemes to which the outer planets Uranus and Neptune belong, we have but little information, though we know that the latter is in its fourth incarnation. Because of the fact that to it belong also the two other physical planets whose orbits lie outside its own. The conditions existing on all these gigantic outer members of the solar systems must be altogether so entirely different from those on the small inner planets that it is practically impossible to form any idea of the sort of life which must be lived by their inhabitants. Even in the future when the globes have cooled down. Successive life waves. The conception of the successive life waves which pour out from the logos should not be a difficult one, yet it frequently happens that some confusion seems to arise in the mind of the student in connection with it. Perhaps this comes partially from the fact that the term life wave has been employed in our literature in three distinct senses. First, it has been used to denote the three great outpourings of divine life by means of which our solar system came into existence, by which its evolution is carried on. Secondly, it has been applied to the successive impulsions of which the second outpouring is formed, and it is in this sense principally that I shall employ the term now. Thirdly, the expression has been accepted as signifying the transference of life from one planet of our chain to another in the course of evolution. A life wave of this third type does not at all correspond to the life wave of the second type, but consists of synchronous portions of 7 of the latter, treated as though they constituted a single entity. As we all know, we have with us at the present time 7 kingdoms in manifestation, the human, the animal, the vegetable, the mineral, and the 3 elemental kingdoms which precede the mineral. We must realize that all these are manifestations of the same life, the one life of the Logos manifesting in that second great outpouring which comes from his second aspect after the primitive matter has been prepared for its reception by the action of the first outpouring which comes from the third aspect, see the Christian Creed. p. 40. That second outpouring comes forth in a series of successive waves, following one another as the waves of the sea follow one another. Each of these waves has reached its present stage by passing through all the earlier stages, and in each of those it has spent a period of time corresponding to the life of a chain of 7 worlds, sometimes called a Manvantara. This Sanskrit word Manvantara literally means the period between 2 manas, and so it might be applied at various levels. We see from the secret doctrine that each root race has its Manu, a great adept who takes charge of it, and superintends its formation and growth. But there is also a Manu for the world period which includes the 7 root races. And yet again there is a still greater Manu who superintends the progress of the life wave, using that term in its third sense, through all the 7 planets of the chain. And since one complete journey through all those 7 globes has been called a round, he is spoken of as the round Manu. 7 such rounds complete one life period for a planetary chain, one incarnation of the chain, as it were. And over this enormous period there is a great one who presides, and to him also this title of Manu is accorded. Higher still there is one who presides over the 7 successive chains, which may be regarded as the 7 incarnations of our chain, making one complete scheme of evolution. But he is usually spoken of not as a Manu, but as the logos of 7 chains, or sometimes as the planetary logos. So we have here a graduated hierarchy of mighty adepts, extending up to divinity itself. It is obvious, therefore, that the term Manvantara might indicate various periods of time, corresponding to the levels at which it was employed. But in our theosophical literature it has generally been used to indicate the duration of one chain, the time occupied by the life wave in making 7 rounds. To the greater period of the 7 successive incarnations of the chain, the name of Mahamanvantara, which means simply Great Manvantara, has sometimes been given. The following table may be of use to our students, as summarizing the system of evolution. 7 branch races make 1 subrace. 7 subraces make 1 root race. 7 root races make 1 world period. 7 world periods make 1 round. 7 rounds make 1 chain period. 7 chain periods make 1 planetary scheme. 10 planetary schemes make our solar system. It is scarcely practical for us at present to endeavor to estimate in years the exact length of these enormous expanses of time. In exoteric Hindu books definite numbers are given, but Madame Blavatsky tell us that it is impossible to rely fully upon these, as other and esoteric considerations are involved, which the writers do not take into account. We have no direct information upon these points, but there is some reason to suspect that the time of the rounds is not an invariable quantity, but that some are shorter than others. It has been thought that those in front of us will probably not be so long as those through which we have passed, but here again we have no certain information, and it seems useless to speculate. At all these stages there are always 7 life waves in action. In every one of these chains is a human kingdom, and it is always accompanied by its brothers, an animal, a vegetable and a mineral kingdom. But each of these is steadily evolving. So that the life wave which is ensouling the animal kingdom of the present day will in the next chain have arrived at the human level and will provide the causal bodies for the humanity of that chain. In the same way the life wave which ensouls our vegetable kingdom now will ensoul the animal kingdom then, and so on. It of course follows from this that we were the animal kingdom of the moon chain, and the vegetable kingdom of the chain previous to that. That is not precisely an accurate method of expression, because we as separate egos did not exist then. But that wave of essence which in the first chain ensouled the mineral kingdom, in the second chain the vegetable, and in the third chain the animal, has now been employed in the formation of those causal bodies which we are inhabiting at the present day. What then will be the future progress of that wave, and how will it appear in the next chain? It will not appear there at all, for we must remember that at the close of this human evolution man finds always before him the 7 paths which open the way to still further development. I have tried to explain these, so far as they may at present be described, in the concluding chapter of Invisible Helpers. I need not repeat here what I then wrote, but I may add to it a fragment of information which has since come to my knowledge. One of those paths, which we had then to leave blank, leads to what we have called a staff appointment. Every general has, quite apart from the regular officers who hold various commands under him, a special set of officers who form his staff, whose duty it is to be in personal attendance upon him, and to be ready at any moment to do anything that he may require, or to fill any vacancy that may occur. The Solar Logos also has his staff, a number of adepts who are not in the service of any particular chain, yet ever prepared to be sent to the aid of any that need assistance. To join this body is one of the 7 possibilities which lie before him who has reached the further shore. When the time comes for our chain to disintegrate and for the life from it to pass into the 5th chain, we shall already have moved on to a stage beyond the human, along one or other of these 7 paths. Consequently the humanity which will commence as primitive man in the 5th chain will not be ourselves at all, but will be the wave next behind us, that which is ensouling our present animal kingdom. In the same way our vegetable monad will have evolved a stage higher, and will ensoul the animal kingdom of that new chain. While the life wave which is now animating the mineral kingdom will by that time have risen to the level of the vegetable kingdom. Thus we see that of the 7 life waves which we now know, 6 will be present in the 5th chain, but each will have gained a stage in its development. Our present human life wave, having obtained the object of its immersion into matter, has passed out of this series of chains altogether. Though some of those who were its members may still retain a voluntary connection with it for the purpose of helping its evolution. But since each of our waves has moved on a stage, how is the place of the hindmost supplied? Are we to suppose that the first elemental kingdom will no longer be represented in the new chain? By no means. For we find that a fresh life wave from the Logos is following close behind the others, and so this new influx completes the 7. Precisely the same process has taken place in connection with each chain in succession. In each of them one life wave has attained its goal, and passed off through 7 channels to some entirely higher form of manifestation. And each of those behind it has moved forward one stage, and place of the hindmost has in each case been filled by a fresh influx of life from the Logos. Each of these waves enters in each chain period at the lowest level of the kingdom which it is ensouling, and passes out of that kingdom at its highest point. A fresh influx of life from the Logos enters the first elemental kingdom in each chain, and there are 6 such influxes in our scheme, so that we have altogether 13 successive life waves at work in this scheme of 7 chains. Though never more than 7 of them are in operation simultaneously. All are moving steadily onward but always preserving the same distance between them, and we can take up any particular wave at any point in its progress and follow it backwards or forwards as we desire. Take for example the 7th of these waves. It enters into the first incarnation of the chain as the first elemental kingdom, in the 2nd chain it has reached the level of the 2nd elemental kingdom, and in the lunar chain it ensouls the 3rd. In our present chain it animates our mineral kingdom, while in the 5th and 6th chains it will ensoul respectively the vegetable and animal kingdoms. In the 7th chain it will arrive at the level of humanity, and will then pass off through its 7 channels, as the other humanities have done. We have then the complete history of this life wave before us, from the time when it emerged into manifestation in the first elemental kingdom, until it is again attaining divine levels at the end of its appointed evolution. We have not before us in our scheme the complete evolution of any other wave than this. If, for example, we trace back our own life wave, we shall find that it ensouled the animal kingdom in the moon chain, the vegetable kingdom in the 2nd chain, and the mineral kingdom in the 1st chain. Where then did it gain the evolution of the 3 elemental kingdoms? For it must obviously have advanced through those stages before it manifested as the mineral. It has passed through them in some previous scheme of chains, we know not where or when. It is evident that the only entirely new impulse is that first chain of our scheme was the 7th life wave. For all the others which form part of that first chain had already gone through some portion of their evolution in anterior schemes of worlds. Its humanity must evidently have passed through the 6 antecedent stages in that unknown past, and it came here only to acquire the finishing touch to its education which prepared it to pass off along the 7 paths which lay open before it. But our life waves stretch onward into the future as well as back into the past. The 8th wave, for example, which entered for the first time in the 2nd chain as a fresh impulse from the divine life, has no time in our scheme of evolution to reach the human level. In our present chain it is ensouling the 3rd elemental kingdom, and causing us a great deal of trouble in the shape of desire elementals. In the 7th chain that wave will be ensouling the animal kingdom, and it will therefore attain humanity in the 1st chain of some unknown scheme of globes, hidden at present in the womb of the future. Naturally the remaining waves, from the 9th to the 13th, are also unfinished, so that out of all the waves which use our scheme as the theater of their evolution only one finds time to complete all its stages, a fact which, if we can realize all that it involves, gives us a deeply impressive illustration of the vastness of the resources of nature, a glimpse into the illimitable eternities through which, never hastening yet never resting, her unfoldment proceeds with such splendid precision. Now that we have clearly in our minds the steady progress of these life waves, we must immediately proceed to modify our conception by the introduction into it of another important factor. In each case of transference from one kingdom to another, there is always a certain part of the life waves which does not succeed in passing, and is therefore left behind. We may perhaps understand that most easily if we begin by thinking of the future of our own humanity. We know that the goal set before us is the attainment of that level of initiation which has been called adeptship, the position of the asceta, the one who has no more to learn with regard to our planetary chain. But we also know that it will not be the whole of humanity that will succeed in this lofty aim, but only a certain part of it. We are told that in the middle of the next round a separation will occur between those souls who are strong enough to undertake the higher stages of evolution and those who are not. This separation has been prefigured by the many legends of a last judgment, at which the future destiny of the souls for this aeon would be decided. The diseased imagination of the medieval monk, always seeking an opportunity to introduce grotesquely exaggerated horrors into his creed in order to terrify an incredibly ignorant peasantry into more liberal donations for the support of Mother Church, distorted into eternal damnation the perfectly simple idea of Aeonian suspension. Those who are left behind at this period have sometimes been described as the failures of the fifth round, though perhaps even this is somewhat too harsh a term. There may well be some among them who by greater exertion might have qualified themselves to pass onward, and these are rightly spoken of as failures. But the majority will be left behind simply because they are too young to go on, and so not strong enough for the more difficult work. The facts of the case may be stated quite simply. The lower classes of monads passed only gradually from the animal kingdom into the human during the earlier half of our present chain period. Some of them are still, consequently, at an early stage of the human evolution, and are therefore exceedingly unlikely to overtake the classes which are so far in advance of them. We have been given to understand that it is just possible for even the lowest savage to reach before the middle of the fifth round the level necessary for continued evolution. But in order to do this he must never once fail to take advantage of each opportunity as it is offered to him, and the number who will do this will be infinitesimally small. It is calculated that the proportion who will be prepared to go on will amount to about 3/5 of the total population of the earth, not merely of the physical population, it will be understood, but of the total number of egos who constitute the human life wave evolving through this chain, while the remaining 2/5 will be left behind. The surroundings in the world at that time will be specially adapted for the rapid progress of the more advanced egos, and will therefore be wholly unsuitable for entities at a much lower stage of evolution. As the gross vibrations of violent passion and of strong coarse feelings which are necessary for the development of the inert and half-formed astral body of the savage will be no longer available, we can easily imagine many ways in which this unsuitability would show itself. In a world of high intellectual and spiritual development, where war and the slaughter of animals have long been things of the past, the existence of savage races, full of undisciplined passions and desire for conflict, would obviously introduce many serious difficulties and complications. And though no doubt means might be devised for their repression, that very repression would debar them from the activities requisite for their early stage of evolution. Obviously, therefore, the kindest and best thing to do with those who are thus backward is simply to drop them out from this evolution, and let them prepare to take their place in next year's class, in the next planetary chain. Such entities will not suffer in any way. They will simply have a very prolonged period of rest in such heaven life as they may be capable of appreciating, and no doubt, even though their consciousness during this period will probably be but partially awakened, a certain amount of inner progress will be going on. From that condition they will descend into the earlier stages of the evolution of the next chain, and will be among the leaders of primitive humanity there. We should not think of them as in any way put back, but merely as assigned to the position to which they really belong, where their progress is easy and certain. It is to this class that Madame Blavatsky referred when she spoke of vast numbers of lost souls. Though this term lost souls, when employed in this connection, sometimes misleads students who have not yet grasped the full splendor and certainty of the evolutionary scheme. We may think then of each life wave in its passage through the chain as breaking up into wavelets. Consider what will be the progress made by our own life wave. Broadly speaking, this represents the animal kingdom of the moon, though the failures of the lunar humanity have naturally joined it, and may be expected to be among its leaders. The whole of the wave which ensouled that lunar animal kingdom should theoretically have entered humanity during the earlier part of this chain, and should by the end of the 7th round attain the goal appointed for it. We who are now human beings in this chain ought all of us to attain adeptship, and pass away from this scheme of evolution altogether by one of the 7 paths which open before the adept. While what is now our animal kingdom ought by the end of this chain to attain individualization, and therefore to be ready to furnish the humanity for the next chain, the 5th of the scheme. We know, however, that 2/5 of our humanity will fall out in the middle of the 5th round, because it is obviously too far behind the rest to enable it even with the greatest efforts to attain the goal during this chain. This 2/5 will enter the next chain along with the members of our present animal kingdom, and will therefore constitute part of that future humanity. One of the great reasons why the division between the more advanced and the less advanced must be made in the middle of the 5th round is that the later races will be in much closer touch with the adepts and the great devas than we are now. It will therefore be necessary for them to hold themselves always in an impressible condition, in readiness to receive and respond to an outpouring of influences. This in its turn requires that they shall live a peaceful and contemplative life, which would be an impossibility if there were still left in the world savage races who would attack and kill the man in a state of contemplation. The more powerful vibrations of that time would not rouse the higher nature of the savage, but would only stimulate and intensify his lower passions, so that he would gain nothing by being on earth at that period, while he would make impossible the progress of the more developed people. But the other 3/5 of our present humanity, which may be described as successful in so far as it does not drop out at the day of judgment in the 5th round, will yet not all of it succeed, in the sense of attaining the aseka level. It is thought that probably about 1/5 of the whole number, that is to say, 1/3 of those who have not dropped out, will fully achieve. But that means that 2/3 of the successes will still at the end of our chain of worlds have further work to do, before they have reached the level intended for them. They also will have to enter the next chain, though they will not need the earlier stages of its evolution, so they will probably appear at about its middle point. Much as the higher classes of monads who came over from the moon entered our present evolution at its middle point. The matter will, however, be complicated for them by the fact that, just as on this chain the point set before us for attainment is higher than that of the moon chain, so will the level of achievement expected on the 5th chain be higher than ours. With that, however, we have no concern for the moment. The actual distribution at the end of our planetary chain will probably be into several well-defined classes, somewhat as follows. Though obviously each of these might be further subdivided. 1. Those who, having intelligently studied evolution and determined to take the shorter and steeper path to the goal, have already attained adeptship in previous rounds. 2. Those who attain the aseka level in the 7th round. These are the highest class of the men who have moved along with the ordinary stream of evolution, the vanguard of those who have followed the usual path. They may be taken as corresponding, for our chain, to the first class of the moon men. 3. Those who have fallen short of this perfect attainment, but yet have succeeded in reaching the arhat level in the 7th round. They correspond for our chain to the second class of the moon men, and will need very few births in the next incarnation of the chain before they also gain the level of liberation. 4. Those who, while they passed the examination at the middle of the 5th round, have not yet succeeded in raising themselves above the 3 lower levels of the path proper. These may perhaps be taken to correspond for our chain with the animal men of the moon, who had only just contrived to separate themselves from the animal kingdom, and consequently had much preparatory work to do in the new chain. 5. Those who, while they succeeded in attaining humanity in our earth chain, yet failed to raise themselves sufficiently to justify their continuance in that chain after the middle of the 5th round. There will, no doubt, be several subdivisions or classes among these. 6. Those who have failed altogether to gain the level of humanity. These will be some of the very lowest of the monads, who had only just reached the animal kingdom on the moon, and have been slowly rising during the Earth chain, but have not succeeded in attaining individualization. It is not only in the case of humanity that we find this failure to attain the destined level. The same thing appears to happen in connection with every kingdom all through the course of evolution. While the majority of each wave of monads fulfill the destiny appointed for them, there is in each a minority who fall behind, and a much smaller minority who run far in advance of that destiny. For example, just as a few men are now rising far above their fellows and attaining adeptship, so a few animals are even already breaking away from their group souls and becoming individualized. Though the great body of the animal life wave will arrive at individualization only towards the end of the 7th round, and will form the humanity of the 5th chain. The men who are approaching adeptship are always those who are in close touch with the existing adepts as their pupils. The animals who are approaching humanity are usually those who are in close touch with the existing humanity as pets specially developed in affection and intelligence. In the earlier days of the theosophical teaching we supposed that even if an animal by specially rapid development should become individualized here and now, he would still have to wait until the next chain before he could secure a human body. Later investigations, however, have shown us that exceptions to this rule are at this stage still possible. And that animals who are fortunate enough to attain individualization during this present world period may be accommodated with primitive human bodies at the commencement of the occupation by our life wave of the next planet in our present chain. It is obvious that the number of animals prepared to take advantage of this, which, so far as we can see, appears likely to be their final opportunity of entering the human life of this chain, must be relatively exceedingly small. But still it is a possibility which we must take into account if we wish correctly to comprehend the course of evolution. I have once seen a case in which there were special features that made an even earlier incarnation possible, a case of an animal which had shown in earth life not only great intelligence, but also unusually strong devotion to his human friend. A devotion which of course continued in the astral life and was even stronger there than ever. The animal's power of definite thought was such that during life he frequently traveled great distances in his astral body when asleep, to visit his master on his journeys. In this case definite progress was made in the astral life after death, and the response to our efforts was much greater than we had hoped. For the astral life gave us a better opportunity than was possible on the physical plane to grasp the exact limits of the animal's lines of thought. They were few, narrow and curiously limited, but yet they extended much further along their lines than one would suppose. Certain new lines of thought opened up in the astral life, and the developments were exceedingly interesting. An almost immediate incarnation in this world was clearly possible, but there were some curious combinations which made the matter difficult to arrange. The animal would have been a primitive savage in many ways, and yet could only have been incarnated in immediate personal relation with his master, for whom his attachment was so strong that it would have been impossible to keep him away from him. This presented serious difficulties, but still they might somehow have been overcome. But for the fact that it was impossible to guarantee the sex of the savage. Presumably among the animals that succeed there will also be various classes, corresponding in a general way in this evolution to the various classes of monads in the lunar evolution. And some of the animal essence at present ensouling the lowest forms of life will certainly fail to attain the human level in this chain, and will therefore correspond in the animal kingdom to our failures of the 5th round. As to whether these forms also will disappear from the earth at that same period in the 5th round we have no direct information, but analogy would seem to require that this should be so. The same differentiation into classes, according to the measure of success achieved, has been observed in connection with all the lower kingdoms. So that in reality each life wave ought to be symbolized as breaking up constantly into ripples or wavelets, some of which in time join the preceding or succeeding waves, though the majority move steadily along their appointed course. The 7 life waves which ensoul our 7 kingdoms have always for their principal field of action the planet to which the attention of the Logos is for the moment directed. But a certain small proportion of their action is always manifesting in the other worlds of the chain also. Thus, although the attention of the planetary Logos is now fixed upon our Earth, there are yet representatives of all the kingdoms simultaneously existing upon every one of the 6 other globes of our chain. These are often described as the seed from which the forms will develop when the life wave reaches the planet, that is to say, when the special attention of the planetary logos is turned to it once more. These forms have remained in existence upon their respective planets ever since they were first filled by the lunar animal men in the first round. And in this way the trouble of what might be called fresh creation for each globe in each round is avoided. The life ensouling these forms during the comparative obscuration of those planets is still part of the great wave, and is still moving onward in connection with it. It serves other functions besides that of providing the seed for the incoming wave, since it is also employed as a means of more rapid evolution for certain classes of monads. It is by the special treatment thus given that it is possible for the second-class monad to overtake the first class and become one of its members. Under certain conditions of strong desire for advancement, if he is seen to be striving with exceptional vigor to improve himself, he may be separated from the great masses of his fellows on this planet, and passed by the authorities into what is called the inner round, and may take his next incarnation among the limited population of Mercury. In that case he will spend there about the same time that he would otherwise have devoted to incarnations in one root race, and will then pass on to the astral planet F. After a similar stay there he will be transferred to globes G, A and B successively, and then to Mars and to the Earth. As in each of these spheres he will have made a stay about equivalent to the normal period of a root race, the life wave will have left the Earth before his return, but he will overtake it upon the planet Mercury, and will then join the ranks of the first-class monads and share the remainder of their evolution and their varied opportunities of more rapid development. Entities engaged upon this special line of evolution form the majority of the small population of Mercury and Mars at the present time. In the latter planet there is also a certain residuum of primitive mankind which was unprepared to pass on when the life wave left for the Earth, a race which represents a stage of humanity lower than any at present existing within our cognizance. It will probably be extinct long before we reach Mars in the 5th round, since there appear to be no other egos needing manifestation at that level for the moment. In the same way we find that all the kingdoms are represented upon the astral and mental globes. It is not very easy for us to grasp with our physical consciousness what can be the condition of the life of the lower kingdoms on these higher planes. The idea of the evolution of a mineral on the mental plane, for example, suggests nothing readily comprehensible to the ordinary mind. We may perhaps help ourselves towards the understanding of it by remembering that every mineral must have its astral and mental counterparts, and that the special types of matter which form these are also on their respective planes manifestations of the mineral monad, and we may suppose that through such manifestations that monad is evolving during its existence on these loftier levels. The group soul must always contain within itself latent possibilities connected with the higher planes through which it has descended. And it may be that in those stages of evolution these potentialities are being developed by some method quite outside those with which we are familiar. Without the unfolding of psychic faculties we cannot expect to understand in detail the hidden growth in these exalted spheres of finer matter. The important point is that we should realize that although the great life wave resides only upon one globe of our group at a given time, the remaining planets are by no means dormant, and useful progress is continually being made in every part of our chain. I have tried to make the above description of the successive life waves as clear as possible. But lest it should still present some difficulties to the mind of a reader unaccustomed to the study of this system of cosmogony, I append a little diagram which I think may be of assistance. The vertical columns indicate the successive incarnations of the chain, the horizontal divisions represent the various kingdoms of nature, the diagonal arrows are the successive waves of evolution which have come forth from the logos. The Roman numbers attached to each of these arrows apply to those arrows only, and not to the squares in which they happen to come. It will be seen that there are 13 of these arrows. Their length appears to vary, but that is only because we are regarding them solely from the point of view of our own scheme of evolution. Within the limits of that scheme arrow no eye appears to cross only one kingdom, the human. That does not at all mean that the wave represented by that arrow has not passed through the 6 previous stages, it means only that those 6 previous stages have been experienced in some other scheme. Just the same thing is true at the opposite corner of the diagram. Arrow number 13 crosses only one kingdom, the first elemental. It will inevitably in due course have to pass through all the other kingdoms, but it cannot do so in this scheme of evolution, because that is already at an end. So far as our diagram is concerned, it appears in that one kingdom only. If we take the column representing any one chain, let us say the fourth, which denotes our present stage of evolution, we shall find in running the eye down it that 7 arrows pass through it, indicating the 7 kingdoms now existing around us. We can follow any one of those arrows either backwards or forwards, and so can trace any of our kingdoms either in the past or in the future. We should note that waves know I to know.vi come to us from some other scheme of evolution, while waves know 7 to number 13 are fresh emanations from the logos. The monads from the moon. Those who have studied the theosophical system are aware that we divide humanity into various classes according to the age of the ego, and the degree of his development. Transaction No. 26 of the London Lodge gives this arrangement very clearly, and it is also to be found in Chapter 12 of the Ancient Wisdom. But our students will see that the author of the last-named work has altered the numbering of the classes so as to bring it more nearly into agreement with that adopted in the Secret Doctrine. Mrs. Besant separates from the rest those entities to which the London Lodge transaction had given the titles of the first and second classes, and calls them solar monads. So that she begins her list of the lunar monads with those that the transaction had called the third class, and to it she gives the name of the first class. Consequently, in the Ancient Wisdom the fourth class of the transaction is called the second and the fifth becomes the third. Madame Blavatsky's fourth class covers Mr. Sinnett's sixth and seventh, while the remainder of her classes includes entities which he did not take into account at all. His classification dealt only with members of the lunar animal kingdom, which would become human on our earth chain. Hers took in everything which passed over from the lunar chain to this. Her fifth class represents the vegetable kingdom of the moon, and her sixth class its mineral kingdom, while her seventh includes all 3 of its elemental kingdoms. Since the writing of the Ancient Wisdom and the Pedigree of Man, Mrs. Besant has thought it advisable to adopt clearly descriptive English names in place of those which have previously been used. To those who fully succeeded upon the moon chain, and attained the Arhat level prescribed for them, she gives the title of Lords of the Moon. Those whom she had previously called solar monads, whom Mr. Sinnett had described as first and second class Pitris, are now to be called moon men of the first and second orders respectively. The first order of moon men has many subdivisions, as we shall see directly. What she previously called the first class monads, Mr. Sinnett's third class, are now described as lunar animal men. Her second, third and fourth classes, corresponding, as above stated, to Mr. Sinnett's fourth, fifth, sixth and seventh, are now described as the first, second and third divisions of the lunar animals. This completes the list of the entities constituting our present humanity, as Madame Blavatsky's lower classes, of which Mr. Sinnett took no account, will not attain the human level in the present chain. These classes are arranged in the order of their advancement, and they differ not only in appearance but also in the methods by which that advancement is attained. Among other points there is great difference in the length of the intervals between successive incarnations, and in the way in which these intervals are spent, but this part of the subject will be treated in the section on reincarnation. To understand how these classes are distinguished we must remember that for each chain of worlds a definite level of attainment is laid down, and to reach that is to gain full success. In our present chain of worlds the level assigned is that of the Aseka adept, but in the moon chain it was the fourth step of the path, that of the Arhat. Those who fully attained that on the lunar chain had achieved the purpose of the Logos, and so were free to take one or other of the 7 paths which always open before the perfected humanity of each chain. Below them were people standing at many different stages, whom we must to some extent attempt to classify. Broadly speaking, the animal kingdom of one chain makes the humanity of the next. Our present humanity is composed of the successful portion of the animal kingdom of the moon chain, plus those members of the lunar humanity who failed to reach the required level. We have already attempted to show into what classes men must inevitably distribute themselves at the end of evolution upon our own Earth chain. A similar arrangement existed at the end of the lunar chain. Those who had attained the Arhat level were the full successes, and they passed off along one or other of their 7 paths. We do not certainly know that these are the same as the 7 which opened before our own adepts, but at least one of them shows decided resemblance. For just as some of our adepts will remain in close touch with the next chain and incarnate on it in order to help its inhabitants in their evolution, so one of the 7 classes of the Lords of the Moon stayed to help us in our chain. The members of this class are those called in the secret doctrine the Barhishads. Moon Men, First Order. Next below this level comes a large and diversified group to which we are at present giving the title of Moon Men, First Order. Though for convenience in following out the several destinies of its subdivisions it will probably be found necessary presently to assign separate names to them. It includes some who, though they had not succeeded in reaching the Arhat level, were on some of the lower steps of the path, others who had not yet gained that path, though they were approaching it. The failures who had dropped out of the lunar humanity, corresponding to the 2/5 of our humanity who will drop out in our 5th round. And the most advanced representatives of the lunar animal kingdom, who had succeeded in fully developing the causal body. We may later give distinctive names to these subdivisions, but for the present we will merely number them. 1. Those who, although they had not attained arhatship, were already upon one or other of the various steps of the path. These also, like the Lords of the Moon, have long ere this attained adeptship and passed away altogether from the field of our consideration. 2. Those of the lunar chain animal kingdom who attained individualization in the 4th round of the moon chain. All these also have by this time attained adeptship. The masters best known to us in connection with theosophical work belong to this class, and in it we may also include the majority of those who became arhats under the influence of the preaching of the Lord Buddha. 3. Those who attained individualization in the 5th round of the moon chain. These are now the distinguished people of the world, not by any means only those whom the world calls distinguished, but those who, along one line or another, are considerably in advance of their fellows. In our theosophical ranks this means those who are either already on the path or approaching it. In the outer world it means men who are either great saints or of specially high intellectual or artistic development. 4. Those who attained individualization in the 6th round of the moon chain. We have here a fairly large class of people, distinctly gentlemen, persons of refined feeling, with a high sense of honor, and rather above the average in their goodness, intellect, or religious feelings. Typical instances of this class are our country gentlemen and professional men, our clergy or our officers in the army and navy. They have strength, but they are by no means free from the possibility of using their power wrongly. They may not do at all what people around them think they ought to do, and therefore they may often not be considered respectable, but at least they will do nothing low or mean. 5. Those who attained individualization in the 7th round of the moon chain. The members of this class do not differ greatly from those of the last, except that they are somewhat nearer the average in goodness or intellectual development or religious feeling. They turn their intelligence to rather more material ends, as city merchants perhaps. They represent the great division which we commonly call the upper middle class, gentlemen still, yet with a life slightly less elevated than that of the professional man. All these classes which have been mentioned are in reality subdivisions of one class, the first order of the moon men, and all the way through they melt into one another by almost indistinguishable gradations. So that the lowest ego of any one of them differs but little from the highest ego of the next class below. Not only are the lines between them thus not clearly marked, but there is even a good deal of interpenetration. Egos belonging by right to the mercantile class get astray among the professions, while those of the higher type find themselves forced into business. As they say in India, in these days castes are mixed. I have divided them according to the round of the lunar chain in which they became human. When that happens in any of the earlier rounds it usually means that the newly formed ego proceeded to take human incarnations in the next following round. For example, those who were individualized in the 4th round of the moon chain came into human incarnation in the middle of the 5th, and continued to incarnate through the remainder of the fifth, the whole of the sixth, and half of the seventh. In the same way those individualized in the fifth round took up their series of human incarnations in the middle of the sixth, and those individualized in the sixth took birth in the seventh. Those individualized in the seventh round had their first experience of human life on the earth chain, and of course had to be correspondingly primitive on their arrival here. Moon men, second order. Below this huge class comes the second order of the moon men, whose members, having been individualized at a somewhat earlier stage in their animal life, had not yet fully developed a causal body, but had already what might be described as the skeleton of such a vehicle, a number of interlacing streams of force which indicated the outline of the ovoid that was yet to come. These egos had consequently a somewhat curious appearance, almost as though they were enclosed in a kind of basketwork of the higher mental matter. At the present day these are represented by the great mass of the bourgeoisie. What is usually called the lower middle class, a typical specimen of whom would be the small shopkeeper or shop assistant. This class may be described as on the whole well-intentioned, but usually narrow, conventional and dull. They often make a fetish of what they call respectability. A man who is deadly respectable usually does nothing whatever that counts, either for good or for ill. He may go on at a dead level of monotony for many lives, guiding himself always by the canon of what he supposes other people will think of him. We may sometimes see a bourgeois soul even in the higher classes, and when such souls attain power in any country, it indicates that that country is engaged in expiating its evil karma. The reign of such a king as George III in England was the karma of the murder of King Charles I and of the other horrors of Puritanism, and the result was the division between England and America, which is only now being healed. Since people of this level cannot learn the lesson of any particular subrace as rapidly as the higher classes, they usually take many incarnations in each before passing on to the next. Lunar animal men. The next group we call the lunar animal men, those egos who had individualized from the earliest stage of the animal kingdom at which individualization was possible. They consequently commenced their human life without anything which could properly be called a causal body, but with the monad floating above a personality to which it was linked only by certain threads of nirvanic matter. It was they who in the first round filled the forms made by the lords of the moon, and thus did pioneer work for all the kingdoms. In considering them we come at last to what are called the working classes, who make the enormous majority of humanity in every country. Why they alone should receive the honorable title of workers is not clear, for they would assuredly rebel with promptitude and vigor if they were called upon to work as many hours a day as does any successful man of the higher classes. But it is usually taken to signify those who work with their hands rather than with their heads. The particular type with which we are dealing at the moment, those who were animal men on the moon, may be said to work with both, for they are the skilled workmen of the world, belonging to the proletariat, but representing the best class of it. Men of determination and good character, self-respecting and reliable. Below that again we have three classes, whose members had not yet succeeded in breaking away from their group souls, and were consequently not then individualities, though they had every prospect of becoming so during our present earth chain. These are still labeled as animals. First class moon animal. These attained humanity during the second round of the earth chain, and are at the present day represented by the vast mass of unskilled labor, on the whole well-meaning but usually careless and improvident. Along with them we must group the higher types of savages, men like the Zulus and some of the better kinds of American Indians and Negroes. Second-class moon animals. This is a lower type which gained individuality only in the third round the earth chain. We see it exemplified now in savages of comparatively mild type, in some of the hill tribes of India, and among ourselves in the wastrels, the unemployable, the drunkards, and many of the slum dwellers of our great towns. Third-class moon animals. These are the lowest specimens of humanity, but little removed even now from the animal kingdom, which they left only during the earlier world periods of this present round, or even in the earlier races on this earth. It is represented now by the lowest and most brutal of savages, and among ourselves by habitual criminals, by bomb-throwers and wife and child beaters. To this group also may be added a few of those who at various stages were individualized through hatred or fear. Below all these come the three classes which furnish our present lower kingdoms, the lunar vegetable kingdom, which is now our animal, the lunar mineral, which is now our vegetable, and the lunar elemental kingdoms, the most advanced of which has become our mineral kingdom. It is to those whom we have called the animal men that the pioneer work on the earth chain was assigned. Although on the moon they broke away from the animal kingdom, and must therefore be considered as potentially human. On the first globe of the first round of our earth chain they entered into evolution not at the human level but at that of the first elemental kingdom. They passed rapidly from that into the second and third, and then successively through the mineral, vegetable and animal kingdoms until they reached the human. In each of these kingdoms they established the forms, taking the idea of them from the minds of the lords of the moon, on behalf of the Logos, were directing the evolution of that globe. We might rather say, perhaps, that these primitive entities flowed into the molds made by the instructors, and materialized these molds for the use of those who followed them. For close behind them all the time was pressing the next class of monads, the highest of those who had not yet in the lunar chain broken away from the group souls. And behind them in turn came all the rest. When our animal men had completed this work on the first globe in that first round, they moved on to the second globe and repeated exactly the same process there in denser matter. When that was finished they passed to the third, and then to the fourth, and so on, running again through the tedious evolution from the first elemental kingdom up to the human in each of the globes. In order that the forms might be duly prepared for those that followed. At the end of the first round their task was over, and they entered the first globe of the second round at the level of primitive humanity, though it was so primitive that the advantage is scarcely a perceptible one. In the course of that second round the first class of the lunar animals had reached the human level, and the same thing happened in the third round to the second class of lunar animals. But here a fresh complication is introduced by the entry in the middle of the third round of the second order of moon men, who had succeeded on the moon chain in setting up a kind of framework for the causal body. Coming in at this stage, they soon pushed themselves to the front and took the lead. Students will remember that the fourth world period of the fourth round differs from all the rest in that it is to some extent a recapitulation of all the earlier stages. A large number of entities appear to have been on the brink of individualization, but could not quite attain it in the ordinary course of evolution before that middle point of the fourth round when the door was to be shut. A special opportunity was therefore given to them, and the conditions of the first, second and third rounds were reproduced in miniature in the first, second and third root races of this present world period. If we examine humanity as it appeared on Mars in this fourth round, we find that it did not differ radically in appearance from that of the present day, and this is true of all its root races from the first to the seventh. But if we look at the humanity of the first root race on our own globe in this present round, we shall see that its members are utterly unlike any kind of men that we know. They are mere drifting masses of cloud, just the men of the first round over again. In the same way men of our second root race have the curious formless pudding bag appearance which had not until then been seen on any world of our chain since the second round. In the third root race came over again all the business of the descent into denser matter and the separation of the sexes which had distinguished middle of the third round. All this was done only for the sake of backward entities, and it must not be forgotten that only they took part in it, which accounts for the sin of the mindless, the extreme degradation of the forms, and other things. None of the humanity of previous rounds, and previous parts of this round, appeared during that period at all. All its members came in only when the changes in the middle of the third root race had brought matters back to something resembling the conditions to which they were accustomed, though even then the physical vehicles were of so low a type that some of the arrivals declined to occupy them. The whole of the plan of the earlier races of this globe was in fact the offering of a final opportunity to the laggards, and it was to a large extent successful. Many entities who had not been fully able to take advantage of these conditions in those earlier rounds were able to do something with them now. Especially with the aid of the tremendous impetus given to evolution by the descent of the Lords of the Flame from Venus. In this fourth round the third class of lunar animals attained their individuality, and in the middle of the third root race on this globe the less developed of the first order of moon men began to return to incarnation also. From that time until the middle of the Atlantean period, and perhaps even somewhat beyond it, the monads of that first order came rapidly into incarnation, and of course at once took up a position in the forefront of evolving humanity. It is hoped that this attempt at explanation will facilitate the work of those who are studying this most interesting subject. There is, it is true, much complication in detail, but the broad principles are clear, and a student who keeps those in mind will soon grasp the scheme as a whole. The Earth Chain. We have just passed the middle point of the evolution of our chain of worlds. There are to be 7 rounds, 7 journeys round the 7 globes. 3 of those journeys have been completed, and we are now on the 4th, the middle, globe of the 4th round. The middle point of our world period ought to be the culmination of the 4th or Atlantean root race. And as we are now at a comparatively early period in the history of the 5th root race, it is evident that we have only just passed that middle period. We do not know, however, whether the middle point in evolution corresponds to the middle point in time, for we do not know whether all the rounds or all the race periods are of the same length. As I have mentioned before, the probabilities seem to be that they differ, perhaps even differ considerably, and there is reason to hope those lying in front of us may be somewhat shorter than those which are behind us. As I have already said, it is useless even to speculate on the actual length in years of these enormous periods. Some years ago we took considerable pains to verify one of the remote dates given in the secret doctrine, that of 16.5 million years since the separation of the sexes in the middle of the 3rd root race. We found that separation to be a long process which extended over more than million years and was taking place at different times in different parts of the world. Selecting a time when it seemed to have been fairly achieved, we calculated from that time to the present by observing certain astronomical changes, and our result was within 100,000 years of Madame Blavatsky's. As this was an observation made years after her death, and by methods absolutely different from any that I have known her to use, I think we may accept it as a very good corroboration. From what we saw in the course of that inquiry we came to the conclusion that all those earlier radical changes in the constitution of man extended over really enormous periods of time. But that the later changes connected with the development of civilizations passed much more rapidly, so that these latter could be counted by thousands of years, while the former required actually millions. Without then pledging ourselves to anything in the way of dates as regards the earlier part of this stupendous evolution, let us glance rapidly over the work done so far in this earth chain. Before the solar system was brought into manifestation, the Logos formed the entire scheme of it in his mind, and by doing so brought it all simultaneously into existence upon his mental plane. At what level that mental plane may be we cannot tell. It may be what we call the mental cosmic plane, or it may be higher still. To it Madame Blavatsky, so far as it concerns our solar system, has given the name of the archetypal world, and the Greeks seem to have called it the intelligible world. All that we hear or read as to an instantaneous creation of the whole system out of nothing refers to this formation of cosmic thought forms. Indeed, from one point of view it seems as though we were in truth an expression of the planetary Logos himself, and as though the evolution were taking place within his body, as though the globes were centers in that body, or rather, not the globes that we see, but the spirit of them, their higher principles. From this point of view globe A would be the expression of his brain or mental body, and all these forms would exist in his mind. For our mental plane is not only the 3rd subdivision of the lowest cosmic plane. It is also at the same time the lowest subdivision of an aspect or manifestation of the Logos. We may take it that he manifests himself along 7 lines or through 7 aspects, and that each of these that we call planes is the lowest form of one of these aspects. So that the atomic part of our mental plane is really the lowest subplane of the mental body of the planetary Logos. Before the Manu of a chain or of a round commences the task appointed for him, he examines the part of that mighty thought form which refers to his work, and brings it down to some level within easy reach for constant reference. The same thing is done at a somewhat lower level by the Manu of each world and of each root race. Each Manu at his own level has before him the model towards which he has to build, and he endeavors to make his race or his world, as the case may be, as nearly as possible an exact copy of what the Logos intended it to be. As he has to build with existing materials, he can usually approach the required perfection only by degrees, and so the earlier efforts at the formation of a race, for example, are often only partially successful. In the first round of the Earth chain, the Manu in charge brought down all the archetypes for the whole of the chain. Although many of these will not be fully perfected down here until the 7th round, the germs of all of them were already there even in the first round. For every kingdom in nature he selected a certain set of forms, which he wished to have vivified during the first round, with the view of developing from them at later stages everything which the Logos wished the Earth chain to produce. The scheme of these forms, materialized down to a level where they could use them, was handed over to certain of the Lords of the Moon, who were entrusted with the work of setting the activities of the first chain in motion. They made these forms in each of the 7 worlds of that first round, and as they made them the animal men from the moon entered them, solidified and used them. And from them generated others which could be inhabited by the moon animals which occupied the stages below them. On each of the planets these lunar animal men began at the lowest level, with the forms necessary for the first elemental kingdoms. Then they passed through in rapid succession the 2nd and 3rd elemental kingdoms, and then the mineral, vegetable and animal until they reached the human. Having done this on each planet, they attained humanity for the last time on the 7th planet of the lunar chain. Since then they have rested from that particular kind of labor, for on the 2nd round and afterwards they were human from the beginning. The conditions during that first round were different from any that have prevailed since. First, the life was in all cases a stage higher, for when the planets were first brought into existence they were at the same level as those of the moon chain. Globes A and G, for example, which are now on the lower levels of the mental plane, were then the theater for life belonging to the higher levels. The globes themselves were built even then of the lower mental matter, but it was not in a condition to be inhabited by beings at its own level, not sufficiently condensed nor sufficiently at rest. Globes B and F, though composed of astral matter, were then utilized only for forms of lower mental matter. Mars and Mercury were still in a condition largely gaseous and etheric, and only astral bodies were employed by the entities who lived their lives upon these 2 planets. Our own planet D already contained a good deal of solid physical matter, but in a condition of heat so intense that there were still lakes and seas and even showers of molten metal. So that it would have been quite impossible for people with bodies in the slightest degree like ours to live there at all. The inhabitants, however, used only vehicles of etheric matter, and therefore were not at all incommoded by these conditions. In the interval between the first and the 2nd round the matter of the various globes had time to settle down into a more orderly condition, so that each of them could be inhabited by entities using vehicles at the level of its own matter. It is difficult for us to imagine what the evolution of that first chain can have been. It is even difficult for those of us who have repeatedly watched it to give any account of it in words upon the physical plane. It is by no means easy to realize even the present condition of Globe A. We can understand that the men of that globe are living in their mental bodies, and we can imagine to some extent that the group souls of animals and vegetables may somehow or other exist at such a level. But what can a mineral be upon the mental plane? It would correspond to our thought of a mineral. Yet perhaps we should be wrong to assume that such a thought form as we could make of gold would be the only representative of gold on that level. The thought form which exists there is that of the Manu, and is molded by a power altogether beyond comparison with that of our mentality. Every article which exists on the physical plane must also exist in a certain sense upon all the planes above it, since it is a manifestation of the divine life, and must therefore have its connecting link through all the planes. It must be on these higher correspondences of the minerals that certain effects are produced which constitute for them the evolution of those less material globes. But the idea is not one which can readily be explained or made to gear in with the conceptions of the physical brain. It is the bringing down of the mind energies flowing from the Logos, from his cosmic mental plane to that Prakritic mental which is our mental plane. It is his idea of a mineral, materialized as low down as our thought of the etheric body of a mineral. When the whole thing was brought down upon Globe D in the first round, the etheric body of a mineral was formed, but even then it was not a whole etheric body, because at this early stage only some of the subplanes were fully vivified. The very atoms also were more sluggish, since only one set of spirali was in activity. In each round an additional force was poured into the atoms, and that brought an additional set of spirali into play, so that now as we are in the fourth round we have 4 sets of spirali in activity. But even now our atom is as nothing in comparison with that which will exist in the 7th round, when all the sets of spirali will be fully working, and the entire atom will be what the Logos intends it to be. The man of Globe A in the first round can hardly be called a man at all, he is a thought. He is what will someday be a mind-body, the germ of a mind-body, bearing perhaps the same relation to its later possibilities as the embryonic form of an infant after the first month bears to the fully developed human body. He has marvelously little consciousness at this early stage. As we have said, on the astral globe B in the first round everything was brought down to the lower mental level and fixed definitely there, with a little commencement of astralization. On Mars men had definite astral bodies, but they were as yet imperfect, for only matter of certain subplanes was then to be had. A little touch of etheric matter was also introduced, though only certain kinds of ether were available. On the Earth in this round men had etheric bodies, but they were mere drifting shapeless clouds, though towards the end of the world period they began to aggregate around themselves gaseous matter as well as etheric. They appear to have absorbed from the intensely heated surrounding atmosphere whatever they required in the way of nutriment. They seem to have had a succession of manifestations which I suppose we must take as corresponding to races, apparently, however, only root races, for there were but 7. And one incarnation, if we can call it an incarnation, for each individual lasted through the whole race. It appears, however, that the world periods were enormously longer then even than they are now, but it is not easy for us, with our ideas of what life means, to understand how these most primitive of men could contrive to evolve at all. The condition of the world has already been described, but we may note that some of the chemical elements were already beginning to combine. By the end of the world period the temperature was considerably reduced, perhaps to about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit on the average, though it remained much hotter than that in certain districts. And in others it had even got down to the level of boiling water. On Globe E, Mercury, they had apparently only the 3 higher ethers, not 4 as they had had upon the Earth. But they had obviously progressed, and were much more alive than they had been, though even now their consciousness seemed amoeba-like. Nevertheless, it is clear that man was already beginning in a blind way to work both upwards and downwards to densify his lower vehicles and upwards to make them more conscious. Primitive though everything was, it is clear that each globe was an advance on that which had preceded it. But in all cases it appears that he had not yet the full consciousness even of any subdivision of matter in which he happened to be working. The impression given rather is that each subdivision was again subdivided, and that he was able to use only this fraction of a part. There seems little to be said with regard to evolution on globes F and G, except that there for the first time we begin to notice the curious phenomenon of failures. On every globe from the first a certain small portion of each kingdom had been intentionally left behind, in order to act as seed for the next occupation of the planet in the following round. If this were not done all the trouble of making the forms afresh would have to be undertaken on each globe in each round. Whereas by the present scheme a certain population is always left on each planet, from which the race can be reproduced in the next round when necessary. The great wave of life moves from planet to planet, as the Logos wills it. When he fixes his attention upon one globe, the life flames out there and evolution pushes rapidly forward. When he withdraws his eyes from it the life fades away, the wheels of progress slacken and the wave passes on to the globe to which his attention has been turned. But the life does not die out altogether. A small population, human, animal, vegetable, still remains, but does not increase. It usually maintains its numbers at about the same level through the untold millions of years until that planet is entered again. When the life wave reaches it once more, when a vast number of egos are ready to incarnate in it, the stagnant race suddenly becomes wondrously prolific, and great changes and vast improvements of all kinds are quickly introduced. And vehicles are soon evolved fit to receive the coming inrush of a far more highly evolved humanity. Meantime, the small and comparatively torpid race has been providing for those who are engaged in the inner round to which I have already referred. As I have said, in the earlier globes of the first round this seed was purposely left behind. But towards the end of that round there were egos who did not achieve quite what was expected of them, who were not fit to go on to globe G at the time when the normal evolution of globe F was over. Such entities were left behind, and worked on steadily among the remnant, passing perhaps, in process of time, to join the remnant of globe G. Possibly also, by means of some extraordinary impulse, occasionally being able to hurry on to try to overtake the life wave, but more often continuing to lag behind, until they are overtaken by the life wave on its next journey round the globes. In this latter case they usually find themselves in a class of monads lower than that to which they had previously belonged. This process is a kind of reversal of the procedure of the inner round. In the inner round the ego runs on ahead of the life wave, and by making an extra journey round the globes raises himself one class higher. These laggards fall behind the life wave and, by losing one round, drop into an inferior class. A certain proportion of these failures appear on every planet and in all the various kingdoms: mineral essence that ought to have reached the vegetable level, vegetable life that should have touched the animal life that should have becomes individualized. No matter of the lower planes is ever carried over from planet to planet. When, for example, we leave this planet in order to incarnate upon Mercury, only the egos will be carried over. Those egos will draw around themselves mental and astral matter belonging to their new planet, and they will obtain physical bodies by entering the baby vehicles provided by some of those who are already inhabiting Mercury. Just at first those vehicles will be of but poor quality, no doubt. But it will not be the first-class monads who require them, for it is a law of this system of evolution that those who reach the highest level on one planet are never born in the early races of the next planet. They do not need such primitive evolution as those early races would give, and so they join the evolution of the planet when a certain proportion of its people have evolved to somewhere near their level, and can provide them with fitting vehicles. Exactly the same thing happens as egos pass from chain to chain. The most developed of the lunar inhabitants are not found in the first round of the Earth chain, but come in only in the middle of the fourth. The egos who incarnate in the first root race on any planet are those who have not progressed beyond the middle of the evolution on the previous planet. Just as it was the animal men from the moon who did all the work in this first round of the Earth chain of which we have been speaking. In connection with this first round it may be well to explain the apparent difference which exists between the theosophical teaching and the theories of Darwin. In this first round, when form appeared for the first time so far as our planetary chain is concerned, the human shape was evolved from the animal, just as the Darwinian theory suggests. Though it is also true that in our present fourth round the process was reversed, and the human form existed on this globe before those of any of the mammals which we now know. For the inconceivably slow process of natural selection from accidental variation we substitute an intelligent direction both of the selection and of the variations. For we hold that the forms evolved only in order that they may be a fitter expression for the evolving life within. Our attitude towards Darwinism is that we agree in broad outline with its discoveries, but carry them much further, since we propound a spiritual as well as a material evolution. In the second round the forms made in the first round were already there, so that it was not necessary to repeat the building process. Each subplane of each plane is divided into 7, so that in each plane there are 49 subdivisions. In this second round man was working at and through the first and second subdivisions of each of the subplanes, so that while he had matter of all the planes in him it was only the 2 lower subdivisions of the 2 lower subplanes that were active. Man may be said to be building his lower quaternary gradually through the earlier half of his evolution. In this second round the races were much more definite, and were clearly distinguishable one from another. Men were no longer mere drifting clouds of etheric or gaseous matter, but had succeeded in developing a certain amount of solidity, though they were still unpleasantly jelly-like in consistency and indeterminate in shape. Madame Blavatsky compares them to pudding bags, because of the curious shapeless projections which they had instead of arms and legs. At the beginning of the round they put out these projections temporarily, just as an amoeba does. But constant repetition of the process at last made the projections permanent, and molded them into some approximation to the form into which they were destined finally to settle. Many of these people were so light and tenuous that they were able to drift about in the heavy atmosphere of the time. Others rolled along rather than crept, but none of them were able to maintain themselves in an upright position without assistance. Man was still lamentably incomplete as regards his higher vehicles. He had what he considered a mind, and something else that might stand for a feeble astral body, but his consciousness was still dim and vague and he had little thinking power, he was all instincts and almost no reason. In this round the animal men maintained and improved their human position, and by the end of it the first class of the animals had definitely attained humanity. Just as all the archetypes of the mineral kingdom had been fully brought down in the first round, though not yet fully worked out, so were all the vegetable archetypes brought down in this second round. Though it was long after that before they were all realized. It is probably chiefly to the vegetation of this period that we owe our coal deposits. In the course of the third round we come to more comprehensible conditions. Even in the earlier globes man became more human in shape than he had been before, though even then he was still cloudy, gigantic and far from beautiful. On Mars in this third round man had for the first time what may be called a recognizably human body, though at first it was still etheric, and more like some kind of reptilian monkey than like man as we know him now. He was still somewhat jelly-like, and if one pressed in his skin by a poke of the finger the hole remained for a long time before it filled out again. He had rudimentary bones, more gristle perhaps than bone, but he was not stiff enough to stand, and so he lay about groveling and wallowing in the soft warm mud at the sides of the rivers. Mars had much more water then than it has now, and much of the country was pretty, though the vegetation was peculiar. The atmosphere was what we should now consider unbreathable, full of chlorine and quite suffocating. All the animal archetypes were brought down in this round, though many of them were not worked out until the middle of our present round. On the earth in the third round great changes took place. Even from the beginning men were more compact and began to try to stand upright, though they were still shaky and uncertain, and always fell back to all fours when pursued or frightened. They began to have hair and bristles upon the body, but they were still loose and flabby. Their skins were dark and their faces scarcely human. Strangely flattened with eyes small and set curiously far apart, so that they could see sideways as well as in front. They had the lower jaw very heavily developed, and practically no forehead, but just a roll of flesh like a sausage where the forehead should have been, the whole head sloping backwards curiously. The arms were much longer in proportion than ours, and could not be perfectly straightened at the elbows, a difficulty which existed with the knees also. The hands and feet were enormous and misshapen, and the heels projected backwards almost as much as the toes did forwards, so that the man was able to walk backwards as rapidly in certain as in the other direction. This curious form of progress was facilitated by the possession of the third eye at the back of the head, which still remains to us in a rudimentary form as the pineal gland. Even yet men had scarcely any reason, but only passions and instincts. They knew nothing about fire, and were unable to count. They ate chiefly certain slimy creatures of reptilian nature, but they also dug up and ate some kind of primitive truffle, and I have seen them tearing off the tops of gigantic tree ferns in order to eat the seeds. Towards the middle of the occupation of this planet the separation of the sexes took place, and soon after that the second order of moonmen began to come into incarnation. They were in the first place born of the existing humanity, but they soon established a new type for themselves, becoming smaller, more compact, lighter in color and generally speaking much more what we should now call human in appearance. There was constant war between them and the earlier and more gigantic inhabitants, who caught and ate them whenever opportunity offered, but the later arrivals, having much more intellect, were presently able to dominate their gigantic congeners, and to keep them in some sort of order. Indeed, practically the whole of the world presently passed into their control, and the earlier races had either to adapt themselves to the more civilized life or to be driven off into the less desirable parts of the country. The world was still far from being as quiescent as at the present time. Earthquakes and volcanic outbursts were still painfully common, and life was distinctly precarious. The configuration of the land was entirely different, and mountains seemed to have attained stupendous heights, unknown to us now. There were enormous waterfalls, and great whirlpools were also common. When the race passed on to Mercury, we find on the whole a decided improvement. Much more affection appeared, and men showed distinct traces of unselfishness, sharing their food instead of snarling over it as they had frequently done at the earlier stages. The presence of the moon men had given a great impetus to progress, and though the bulk of humanity were still very animal and undeveloped, traces of cooperation and rudimentary civilization already began to appear. There is not much to be said with regard to the sixth and seventh planets, so we will turn to the consideration of our present fourth round. On Globe A, in this fourth round, mind became definite on the lower mental level, and so we may say that in this round man began really to think. The result at first was by no means good. In the previous rounds he had not been sufficiently developed to originate thought forms to any great extent, and so the elemental essence of the globes had been affected only by the thoughts of the devas, which left everything harmonious and peaceful. Now that man began to interject his selfish and jarring thoughts, this comfortable condition was very largely disturbed. Strife, unrest and disharmony were introduced, and the animal kingdom drew decisively apart from man, and began to feel fear and hatred towards him. All the archetypes for humanity were brought down at the beginning of this round, among others, archetypes of races which have not yet come into existence. From examining these it is possible to see what the men of the future will be like. They will have finer vehicles in every way, and will be distinctly more beautiful in appearance, expressing in their forms the spiritual forces. When the life wave reached Mars in this fourth round, it found in possession of the planet, besides the ordinary seed humanity, another and most unpleasant race, which is spoken of in the secret doctrine as the watermen, terrible and bad. They were descended from the type which had been left behind in the previous round as not fit to make progress, and they had since then been engaged in developing the evil side of their nature. They were the usual half-reptile, half-ape, but with a horrible tarantula-like appearance about the eyes, and a fiendish delight in cruelty and evil. They seem also to have had a certain amount of low-class mesmeric power, and were a kind of primitive edition of the Malacorumbas as described by Madame Blavatsky in her account of the hill tribes of the Nilgiris. When the life wave came around, the incoming humanity soon established itself sufficiently strongly to free itself from the fear of these monstrous savages. It was to resist possible attacks from them that the first fortifications were erected by man, and it was also to be able to defeat their malignity that men began first to build primitive cities and live together in considerable numbers. At first they built them principally of wood and mud, though sometimes of piles of unhewn stone. At this period some of the lords of the moon incarnated among them and taught them many things, among others the use of fire, which, however, they did not yet know how to produce for themselves. The greater beings lighted their fires for them, and then they kept them perpetually alight. Very early a stringent law was made that a public fire should always be kept burning in a building specially dedicated to it, and the young girls who could not as yet either work or fight were usually left to watch it. From this no doubt arose the first idea of a sacred fire ever to be kept burning as a religious duty, and of the appointment of Vestal virgins to guard it. Sometimes, however, it happened that, from a great flood or tempest or some other catastrophe, a whole district was left for a time without fire. And then the people often had to travel far in order to obtain and carry back to their homes this prime necessity. Some bold spirit conceived the idea of obtaining fire in such an emergency from the crater of a volcano, and many lives were at one time and another lost in such attempts. This was in the fourth root race. The men of the fifth root race were comparatively advanced, for they built their houses of hewn stone, though without mortar. They were a proud and warlike people, but had some curious ideas. They appear to have had no initiative whatever, and they regarded anything new with horror, as exceedingly immoral and repulsive. They had no perseverance, and even yet but little reasoning capacity. Everything was done on impulse, and nothing was under control in any way, so long only as it was nothing new. Yet in many ways they would compare favorably with some races which exist on Earth now. The men of the sixth race were a much more powerful set of people, with a considerable amount of will and determination. They soon dominated the fifth, taking up its civilization and carrying it much further. They succeeded in subduing the whole of the planet and brought it under one rule, although the enormous majority of its inhabitants belonged to the fifth race. These people had much more mind than the others, and possessed some inventive genius, but it was their tendency to do everything by fits and starts, and not take up a piece of work and carry it through. There was some psychic development among them, but it was usually uncontrolled. Want of control, in fact, was a permanent characteristic of this Martian civilization. Everything was erratic, even though the people were capable in certain ways. The people of the seventh race in turn got the power into their hands, not by force, but rather by superior mental development and cunning. They were not so warlike as the sixth, and they were always smaller in number, but they knew more in many ways than the sixth. They were coming nearer to modern ideas, they had a more definite sense of right and wrong. They were less fierce and more law-abiding, they had a definite policy and lived according to it. Their supremacy was entirely intellectual, and they possessed to a high extent the art of combination. Their social polity seems to have been something like that of ants or bees, and in some ways they would compare favorably with many races of the present day. It was in this race that we first noticed writing as a fairly common accomplishment. They knew something of art, for they had both statues and pictures, though totally different in every way from ours. They were also the first race who took the trouble to make good roads. I believe that I have already explained why the earlier races of our present world period differ from all the rest. We were in fact recapitulating the first, second and third rounds for the benefit of those monads who, though considerably behind the rest, could by a special effort of this sort be helped to overtake them. During the third root race was repeated all that had happened in the middle of the third round, the materialization of men on to the physical plane and their separation into sexes. After this had been fully achieved, and a reasonable continuity of form had been arrived at, a number of special efforts were made, by the authorities in charge of the evolution, to consolidate humanity and set it definitely on its way to the higher spiritual advancement which lies before it on the upward arc of the chain. The first step was the descent of 7 of the leading lords of the moon, in order to provide vehicles for the 7 great types or rays of men. We are told in the secret doctrine how each stood on his own lot, and cast off shadows which were inhabited by the men of the lower race. This somewhat mystical statement means simply that these great men duplicated, by an effort of the will, their own etheric doubles. In fact, they materialized round themselves an additional etheric double, made it permanent and then stepped out of it. The other entities of lower race who were just being brought down to the physical level eagerly seized upon these vehicles, entered them and tried to use them. Not being yet fully adapted to them, they found it difficult to maintain their position, and were constantly slipping out. As soon as this happened, some other entity would seize the etheric body, and slip into it as though it were an overcoat, only presently to find it slipping from him in turn, and to see it seized by somebody else. Many of these etheric doubles were made, and by degrees the less developed people learnt how to inhabit them permanently, so that the process of further materialization could be undertaken. And in this way gradually bodies were produced which served to express the 7 great types and their subtypes. The bodies of the children of these entities were by no means equal to those of their fathers, but still certain types were established, and however much the forms deteriorated they were still habitable. As soon as these lines were definite, the special classes of monads from the moon, who had been individualized at an earlier stage for the purpose, were brought down to take possession of them. These were the 3 classes who had been individualized on globes A, B and C of the lunar chain, and I have already described how the first of these classes, the orange-colored group, refused to do its duty precisely because the forms were still in so unsatisfactory a condition. Because of this refusal the forms destined for them had to be occupied by an altogether lower class. And the consequence was that, instead of maintaining the advancement which had been gained by so much effort, the forms were allowed to drop back again into a condition even worse than before. Their undeveloped possessors even intermingled with some of the animal forms. This is what Madame Blavatsky called the sin of the mindless, and the result of it gave us various types of anthropoid apes. The fifth, sixth, and seventh subraces of the third root race were much more what we should now call human than their predecessors. The description previously given of a third-round man would fit aptly enough the man of the fifth Lemurian subrace. These have been often spoken of as the egg-headed people, from the resemblance of their skulls to an egg with the small end up. They had still but little forehead, and the eyes were set near the top of the egg. The men of the sixth subrace were chiefly remarkable for their color. They were no longer black or brown-black like the fifth subrace, but blue-black shading towards the end of the race into a distinct but rather livid blue. The seventh subrace, beginning as gray-blue, passed down through various grayish shades into a kind of gray-white. A fair idea of the type of their faces may be obtainable from the statues which they themselves erected, some few of which still remain upon Easter Island. They had long horse-like faces, the trip of the nose being at first above the center, and at the end of the race exactly in the center, of a line drawn from the top of the forehead to the chin. The forehead was still a mere roll of bone, though growing a little higher towards the end of the subrace. They had thick clumsy lips and broad and flat noses, characteristics which have survived in a less aggravated form among the Negroes who are perhaps now their nearest representatives. No race of pure Lemurian blood now exists. Though the Pygmies of Central Africa appear to represent a long isolated fragment of the fourth subrace. Decreased to their present stature during millions of years in accordance with that curious law which appears to impose diminution of size upon the last relics of a dying race. Most Negro tribes have a considerable admixture of Atlantean blood. In the case of the Zulus, for example, we have in general build and bearing a close representative of the Tlavatli subrace of the Atlanteans, although the color and some of the faces are Lemurian. The men of this seventh subrace were great builders in a rough cyclopean fashion, and they had also a certain rude idea of art. It was during the period of this third root race that there occurred one of the greatest events connected with human evolution, the descent of the Lords of the Flame from Venus. It has already been mentioned that Venus is considerably further advanced in evolution than our Earth chain, and in consequence of that fact many of her adepts are able to move freely about the solar system, and to go and offer assistance wherever it is needed. The determined effort had been made to bring up the backward members of our humanity, by affording the additional opportunity to those who needed it of running once more through such evolution as the first, second and third rounds can give. And when that was over, this further tremendous stimulus of the descent of these great ones was brought to bear as a final effort to individualize as large a number as possible of the more backward entities before what is called the shutting of the door. The period when for the sake of further evolution no more entities could be admitted from the animal kingdom into the human. This band of great ones then arrived from Venus and at once took charge of evolution. Their leader is called in Indian books Sanat Kumara, and with him came 3 lieutenants and some 25 other adepts as assistants. About 100 ordinary human beings who were in some way affiliated to these great ones, or perhaps had been individualized by them, were also brought over from Venus, and merged into the ordinary humanity of the earth. It is these great ones who are spoken of in the secret doctrine as projecting the spark into the mindless men and awakening the intellect within them. We must not allow ourselves to be misled by this rather curious expression into supposing that the lords threw some part of themselves into the human bodies. They acted rather in the nature of a magnetic stimulus. They shone upon the people as the sun shines upon flowers, and drew them up towards themselves, and so enabled them to develop the latent spark and to become individualized. Another point worthy of notice is that none of the lords from Venus took incarnation in our humanity at all. They did not, and indeed could not, take human bodies. They built for themselves instead vehicles like the highest ideals of the human form in appearance, yet absolutely unlike it in that they were uninfluenced by time and incapable of change or decay. I have myself seen several of these marvelous vehicles, and although they have been worn upon this earth for 16 million years they still remain precisely as on the day when they were made. They must be regarded as a kind of permanent materialization, bodies built like statues, and yet to the sight and the touch presenting the appearance of ordinary living men. I know that in the secret doctrine Madame Blavatsky mentioned some of the sons of mind, who came to this earth to help, as incarnating among the people whom they were trying to benefit. But she applies this title to the lords of the moon as well as to the lords of the flame, and it was the former only who entered into ordinary human bodies and so for the time became part of another race. The great lords of the flame have done their work long ago, and most of them have passed away from us to take up their tasks elsewhere. Only a very few still remain with us, holding some of the highest offices of the hierarchy which works for the good of humanity. But for the help kindly given to us by these great leaders the world would have been a very different place today. Without them not only would millions, who became human under the impetus which they gave, be still in the animal kingdom, but all the rest of humanity would be far behind the position in which it now stands. This fourth round is that which is especially destined to the development of the desire principle in man. It is only in the next or fifth round that he is intended to devote himself to the unfolding of the intellect. Owing, however, to the stimulus given by the lords of the flame the intellect has already been considerably developed, and we are therefore for a whole round in advance of where we should have been but for their help. At the same time it should be said that the intellect of which we are now so proud is infinitesimal compared to that which the average man will possess at the culminating point of the next or fifth round. Among other plans for the helping on of evolution, the lords of the flame brought from their planet certain additions to our kingdoms. They imported wheat as a specially desirable foodstuff for humanity, and they also brought in bees and ants, the former to modify the vegetable kingdom and assist in the fertilization of flowers, as well as to provide a pleasant and nutritious addition to human food. It will be noted that both bees and ants live in a manner quite different from that of the purely terrestrial creatures, in that with them a group soul animates the entire ant or bee community, so that the community acts with a single will. And its different units are actually members of one body in the sense in which hands and feet are members of the human frame. It might indeed be said of them that they have not only a group soul but a group body also. Our human evolution has attempted to imitate all these importations, but with somewhat indifferent success. In imitating bees we have produced wasps. And in imitating ants we have produced what are commonly called white ants, as well as curious little ant flies which are almost indistinguishable from them. The nearest that we have been able to get to wheat is rye, but the crossing of the wheat with other native terrestrial grasses has given us oats and barley. After this comes the history of the mighty Atlantean race, to which even today belong the majority of Earth's inhabitants. Towards the middle part of this race came in the first order of moon men, shipload after shipload of them, each taking their places just where they could themselves evolve best. And where they could be of the greatest use to the rest of evolving humanity, to the forefront of which they naturally immediately gravitated. Later than the great Atlantean race came the wonderful history of the Aryans, a grand civilization built up by the great Manu Vaivasvata. Although as yet comparatively in its youth, it already dominates the world, but its greatest glory lies still in advance of us. Soon, under another Manu even better known to us, the sixth root race will be born. But the story of all this will be found in Mrs. Besant's new book Man, Whence, How, and Whither, which contains details of the results of all the recent investigations into the subject. Modes of individualization. Those who have been following the recent discoveries and investigations will remember that in an article not long ago I mentioned the existence, within one of the great classes of monads, of two types which, though equal to one another in development, differ greatly in their intervals between lives, one of them habitually taking nearly double the length of heaven life which is customary with the other. As the amount of spiritual force generated is roughly equal in the two cases, it follows that one type of man must exhaust that force more speedily than the other. Into the same portion of time, as we measure it, he compresses a double amount of bliss. He works as it were at higher pressure, and therefore concentrates his experience and gets through nearly twice the amount in any given period, so that his 700 years is fully equivalent to the 1200 of a man of the other type. The fundamental difference between these two varieties results from the way in which, in each case, individualization was attained. We know that the monad manifests itself upon the nirvanic plane as the triple spirit, and that, when an ego is called into existence as an expression of this triple spirit, its manifestation is arranged in a certain well-recognized form which has frequently been explained in our literature. Of the three aspects, one, the spirit itself, remains upon its own plane. The second, the intuition, or, as our president has now decided to call it, the itself through the matter of the Buddhic or rational pure reason, puts itself down one stage and expresses plane. One, the third, intelligence, puts itself down two planes, and expresses itself through matter of the upper part of the mental plane. The personality is also triple in its manifestation, and is an accurate reflection of the arrangement of the ego. But like all other reflections, it reverses itself. The intelligence reflects itself in the lower mind on the lower part of the same mental plane, the pure reason mirrors itself in the astral body, and, in some way much more difficult to comprehend, the spirit in turn reflects itself upon the physical plane. It is obvious that, when an ego is formed, all three of these manifestations of the spirit must be called forth, but the first connection may be made through any one of the three. It has previously been explained that individualization from the animal kingdom usually takes place through association with the humanity of the period. Such examples of it as we occasionally see taking place round us at the present time will serve as instances for us. Some particular domestic animal, well treated by its human friends, is stimulated by its constant contact with them up to the point where it breaks away from the group soul to which it has previously belonged. The process has been fully described in Man Visible and Invisible and the Christian Creed, and I need not repeat that description here. But a point which is not mentioned in those earlier works is the possibility that the first connection may be made in various ways, between the lower mind and the higher, between the astral body and the pure reason, or between the physical body and the spirit itself. A domestic animal, when well treated, usually develops intense affection for its master, and a strong desire to understand him, to please him, and to anticipate what he is going to do. Sometimes, for a few minutes, the master turns affectionate thought upon the animal, or makes a distinct effort to teach him something. And in these cases there is a direct and intentional action passing from the mental or astral body of the master to the corresponding vehicle of the animal. But this is comparatively rare, and the greater portion of the work is done without any direct volition on either side, simply by the incessant and inevitable action due to the proximity of the two entities concerned. The astral and mental vibrations of the man are far stronger and more complex than those of the animal, and they are consequently exercising a never-ceasing pressure upon the latter. We can see therefore that the character and type of the master will have a great influence on the destiny of the animal. If the master be an emotional man, full of strong affections, the probability is that the development of any domestic animal of his will be chiefly through its astral body, and that the final breaking of the link with the group soul will be due to some sudden outrush of intense affection, which will reach the rational aspect of the floating monad belonging to it, and will thus cause the formation of an ego. If, on the other hand, the master be unemotional and if the chief activities in his nature are of the intellectual type, it is the nascent mental body of the animal which will be stimulated. And the probabilities are that individualization will be reached because that mental development rises to a level too great to permit any longer of enfoldment within the group soul. In yet another case, if the master be a man of great spirituality or of intensely strong will, while the animal will develop great affection and admiration for him, it will yet be the will within the animal which is principally stimulated. This will show itself in the physical body by intense activity, and indomitable resolution to achieve whatever the creature may attempt, especially in the way of service to his master. It is difficult to rid oneself of the idea that the distance between the spirit and the physical body must be far greater than that between the lower mind and the intelligence, or between the astral and rational bodies. But this is not really so, for it is not a question of distance in space at all, but of the conveying of a sympathetic vibration from the reflection to the original. When we think of it in this way, it is obvious that each reflection must be in direct connection with its original, whatever the distance between them may be, in closer connection than it is with any object which is out of the direct line, no matter how much nearer in space the latter object may be. The desire of the animal to rise constitutes a steady upward pressure along all these lines, and the point at which that pressure finally breaks through the restrictions, and forms the required link between the monad and its personality, determines certain characteristics of the new ego which thus comes into existence. The actual formation of the link is usually instantaneous if the first connection is made through affection or will, but it is much more gradual when it is a case of mental development. And this also makes a considerable difference in the current of the future evolution of the entity. In the course of the recent investigations we discovered that, out of a great mass of people who were individualized practically simultaneously at a certain point in the moon chain, those who had attained individualization gradually by intellectual development came into incarnation upon Earth roughly about 1 million years ago, and have since taken between any two lives an average interval of about 1200 years. Whereas those who had attained individualization through an instantaneous uprush of affection or will did not come into terrestrial incarnation until about 400,000 years later. Though as they have since taken an average interval between lives of about 700 years, their condition at the present time is practically the same. I cannot emphasize too strongly that this difference of interval must not in the least be supposed to indicate that those who came in later generate less of spiritual force during their earth lives. If there be any difference, it appears to be in favor of the men of shorter interval, for they, being as a rule more devotional, seem to be able to generate even more force in a given space of time than the others. Perhaps it would express the fact still better to say that they produce in a way a different kind of force. Probably both are necessary, each as a complement to the other. The difference of interval between lives means merely that they take their bliss in a much more concentrated form, and therefore work out the result of an equal expenditure of force in much less time. Indeed, it appears very much as though the period of their respective entries upon terrestrial life had been arranged especially in order that, after running through about the same number of incarnations, they might arrive at the same point, and be able to work together. Later investigations have convinced us that there is far greater flexibility with regard to these intervals between lives than we at first supposed. It is quite true that the amount of force which a man has to work out, first in the astral plane and then in the heaven world, is precisely what he has developed during his earthly life, plus of course such further force of the same kind as he may generate during his astral or heaven lives respectively. But it is evident that the rate at which this amount of force exhausts itself is by no means always the same. The necessity of bringing groups of people into incarnation together, in order not only that they may work out mutual karmic interrelations, but also that they may all learn to labor together towards one great end, is evidently a dominant factor in regulating the rate of the expenditure of force. A study of the lives of Alcyone will show